I spent 35 years building an empire so my family would never know the meaning of struggle. I gave them mansions, designer clothes, and limitless credit accounts. I thought my legacy was secure and my family loved me. Then I had a massive heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon. As I lay in the emergency room fighting for my life, my wife did not rush to my side. She answered the doctor's call, sighed heavily, and asked if I was stable because she had a luxury flight to Hawaii to catch. She left me there to face death alone. Surviving that night taught me a brutal but necessary lesson. A weak heart can break, but a mended heart can become cold enough to freeze traitors out completely. My name is Martin Hayes. I am 69 years old, and before I tell you exactly how I systematically stripped my greedy family of every single dime they thought they owned, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that loyalty should never be a one-way street. The cold marble floor of my downtown Chicago office offered absolutely no comfort as my chest exploded in pure agony. I had just finished reviewing the quarterly logistics reports for the regional freight company I built from nothing. I stood up from my heavy leather chair to look out at the sprawling view of Lake Michigan, and the entire room violently tilted. The pain was not a dull ache or a gentle warning. It felt like an iron anvil crushing my ribcage, radiating down my left arm and up into my jaw with terrifying speed. A metallic taste flooded my mouth. I reached out for the edge of my thick glass desk, desperately trying to steady myself, but my fingers went completely numb. The thick financial folders scattered everywhere as my legs gave out and I collapsed heavily onto the floor. My vision blurred, turning the floor-to-ceiling windows into a chaotic smudge of gray city light. I heard the muffled, frantic screams of my executive assistant bursting through the solid oak door. I heard her panicked voice dialing emergency services, shouting my address into the receiver. By the time the paramedics arrived and strapped me onto the stretcher, I could barely draw a breath. The siren wailed relentlessly through the busy downtown streets, cutting through the heavy afternoon traffic. I closed my eyes as the ambulance swerved, genuinely convinced this was the very end of my story. I prayed my wife Cynthia and my grown children would make it to the hospital in time for me to say a final goodbye. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room were blindingly bright. The absolute chaos of rushing nurses and beeping machines slowly faded into a steady hum as the attending physician injected stabilizers directly into my intravenous line. He carefully reviewed the frantic printouts from the electrocardiogram, his expression deeply serious, before pulling out his mobile phone. I was conscious, though the heavy medication made it difficult to speak. The doctor dialed Cynthia's phone number, the number listed as my primary emergency contact. He placed the phone on speaker and set it on the edge of the bed so I could hear her voice. I waited for the frantic gasp. I waited for the panicked tears of a woman I had loved and provided for over almost 4 decades. Instead, a sharp, incredibly annoyed voice echoed from the tiny speaker. The doctor introduced himself in a calm, professional tone and explicitly explained that I had suffered a severe myocardial infarction and was currently in the critical care unit. Cynthia did not ask if I was awake. She did not ask if I was in severe pain. Her very first response was a heavy, exhausted sigh. She bluntly asked the doctor if I was stabilized, complaining that the entire family was scheduled to fly to Maui in exactly 12 hours. She stated loudly that this luxury trip had been booked for 6 months and the cancellation fees would be absolutely astronomical. The doctor paused, visibly stunned by her grotesque response. I simply stared straight up at the porous ceiling tiles. This unbelievable reaction was not a sudden change in her character. It was the final, undeniable proof of a bitter truth I had actively ignored for years. I vividly remembered the harsh, freezing winters in the early 90s. I worked 80-hour weeks driving commercial freight trucks myself through snowstorms just to afford the down payment on our very first house in the affluent suburbs. I missed sleep, I skipped meals, and I permanently ruined my lower back hauling cargo. When I finally handed her the keys to that house, Cynthia did not thank me or acknowledge my sacrifice. She simply complained that I had missed a neighborhood dinner party to close the real estate deal, embarrassing her in front of her new friends. I spent my entire adult life trading my physical health for their endless comfort and elevated social status. Now, as my heart physically failed me on a hospital bed, she was primarily concerned about a vacation itinerary. The doctor gripped the metal edge of my hospital bed, his knuckles turning white with suppressed anger. He sternly told Cynthia that my condition was highly critical and that the next 24 hours were absolutely vital for my survival. He strongly advised her to come to the hospital immediately to be by her husband's side. Cynthia clicked her tongue in sheer irritation. She told the doctor to just keep her updated via text message, promised to send a nice bouquet of flowers to the room, and abruptly ended the call. The dial tone echoed loudly in the small, sterile room. The doctor looked down at me with a complicated mixture of profound pity and deep disgust. He softly apologized, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder, promising me that his medical team would take excellent care of me even if my family did not show up. I nodded slowly. The intense physical pain in my chest was finally beginning to subside under the heavy narcotics, but an entirely different kind of coldness was taking over my body. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream in anger or beg the nurses to call my children to plead with them. The initial shock washed away completely, leaving a stark, crystalline clarity in my mind. For 35 years, I had believed I was a respected husband and a beloved father. In that single defining moment, I realized I was nothing more than an automated teller machine to them. They viewed my entire life as a financial utility and my potential death as a minor administrative inconvenience to their lavish lifestyle. An hour later, the acute medical danger had officially passed, and the hospital staff carefully moved me to a private, quiet recovery room on the cardiac floor. The night nurse checked my vital signs one last time, gave me a sympathetic, knowing smile, and handed me my personal belongings sealed in a clear plastic bag. I reached inside and pulled out my smartphone. The screen instantly lit up with several pending notifications. A foolish, lingering part of my old self genuinely expected frantic text messages from my son Kendall or my daughter Jasmine. I naively assumed Cynthia had at least called them to explain that their father had nearly died and was lying in a hospital bed. I unlocked the screen to check my messages. There were absolutely zero messages from my children. There was not a single missed call from anyone in my household. Instead, the bright screen displayed an urgent automated fraud alert from my premium corporate black credit card. I opened the secure banking application to read the details. The notification detailed a newly cleared charge of exactly $12,000. The massive transaction was processed exactly 10 minutes after Cynthia hung up on the emergency room doctor. It was a non-refundable premium upgrade payment for an ultra-luxury private cabana at a 5-star resort in Maui. While I was lying helpless on a hospital bed with wires strapped to my failing chest, my wife was using my money to upgrade her beach vacation. I locked the screen and deliberately placed the phone face down on my bedside table. Every ounce of sadness completely evaporated from my soul, replaced by absolute surgical focus. I closed my eyes and began to meticulously calculate exactly how much money and property I legally controlled and exactly how fast I could take it all away. The heavy wooden door to my private recovery room swung open with a sudden jolt. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer high heels against the polished linoleum floor shattered the quiet hum of my heart monitor. I turned my head slowly, fighting the intense residual stiffness in my neck and the heavy fog of the intravenous pain medication. Cynthia marched into the room like a runway model late for a fashion show, followed closely by my son Kendall and my daughter Jasmine. They did not rush to my bedside in a panic. They did not reach out to hold my hand or frantically ask the attending nurses about my long-term prognosis. Instead, they dragged 3 massive matching Louis Vuitton suitcases directly into the sterile hospital environment. The brass wheels of their luggage squeaked loudly against the floor, a sound that felt completely absurd and highly offensive inside an intensive care unit. They were dressed entirely in pristine, brightly colored resort wear. Cynthia wore a wide-brimmed woven straw hat and oversized designer sunglasses, treating my critical medical emergency room like a brief, inconvenient layover terminal. Kendall checked his heavy gold Rolex watch, visibly annoyed by the mandatory detour. Jasmine was entirely preoccupied with her smartphone, rapidly typing out a message with her long acrylic nails without even glancing in my direction. The sheer audacity of their physical entrance wiped away any lingering foolish doubt I had left in my exhausted mind. They were not there to comfort a dying patriarch. They were there to secure the bag before the plane took off. Kendall finally stepped forward, pulling a thick manila envelope from his imported leather briefcase. He did not ask how my chest felt or if I was experiencing any lingering shortness of breath. He did not ask what the chief cardiologist had concluded about my blocked arteries. He simply pulled out a crisp, multi-page legal document and slapped it aggressively onto my plastic rolling tray table. It was a broad, temporary power of attorney agreement. Kendall offered a practiced, insincere smile, the exact kind of hollow smile he usually reserved for his wealthy country club friends when he needed a favor. He smoothly claimed he just needed my signature to keep the logistics company running efficiently while I recovered in the hospital, and they enjoyed their pre-planned family vacation. He spoke to me slowly, enunciating his words as if I were a naive, simple-minded child who could not comprehend basic business operations. He fundamentally misunderstood the man lying in this hospital bed. I built my massive freight empire from a single rusted leased truck by outsmarting ruthless union bosses, surviving predatory commercial lenders, and crushing aggressive corporate raiders. I spent decades of my life reading complex shipping contracts line by line under a desk lamp until my eyes burned. I knew exactly what a broad power of attorney entailed within the legal jurisdiction of the state of Illinois. With this specific, heavily weaponized document, Kendall could legally liquidate commercial assets, authorize massive company expenditures, reallocate investment portfolios, and completely bypass our corporate board of directors without a single vote. He wanted the absolute keys to the kingdom while I was physically incapacitated and heavily medicated. I looked at Kendall, observing the slight nervous sweat forming on his forehead. I looked at Cynthia, who was tapping her manicured nails impatiently against her expensive leather handbag, completely detached from the reality that her husband of 35 years had almost died a few hours ago. I did not argue with them. I did not throw the paper back in their arrogant faces or loudly lecture them on their despicable, unnatural greed. Anger is a loud, chaotic emotion that only serves to warn your enemies of your next strategic move. I chose absolute, impenetrable silence. I nodded weakly perfectly, playing the role of an exhausted, broken, defeated old man. I reached forward for the sleek silver pen Kendall eagerly held out to me. I am strictly right-handed, a basic biological fact my own family should have intimately known. Instead of taking the expensive pen with my dominant hand, I let my right arm hang limply and uselessly by my side. Feigning severe muscle weakness from the cardiac event, I reached slowly across my chest with my left hand. My fingers grasped the cold metal pen clumsily. I pressed the ink tip to the final signature line and dragged it across the heavy paper. The resulting mark was a jagged, shaky, barely legible scrawl that looked absolutely nothing like my legally registered signature on file with the federal bank and the state corporate registry. Any competent forensic handwriting expert or sharp probate judge would instantly flag the signature as physically inconsistent and clearly signed under extreme medical duress. By purposefully using my left hand, I had just rendered their master key completely voidable at a precise moment of my own choosing. I handed the forged document back. Kendall snatched it eagerly, a look of pure triumph flashing across his face, not even bothering to inspect the quality of the wet ink. With the freshly signed legal document safely secured inside his leather briefcase, Kendall checked his gold watch a second time and announced they had to beat the airport traffic. Cynthia adjusted her oversized sunglasses, offering a hollow, practiced smile that completely failed to reach her cold eyes. She patted the very edge of my hospital blanket, extremely careful not to actually touch my skin. She told me to get plenty of rest and listen to the doctors, falsely promising they would bring me back a nice souvenir from the Hawaiian Islands. Jasmine finally looked up from her glowing phone screen just long enough to wave half-heartedly before immediately turning toward the exit. In less than 4 minutes, the entire visit was over. The heavy hospital door clicked shut behind them, leaving me entirely alone with the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. The hospital room felt instantly colder, but my mind was operating with terrifying, unparalleled clarity. I waited exactly 10 minutes watching the wall clock tick to ensure they were entirely out of the hospital building and safely inside their private luxury airport shuttle. Then I reached into the clear plastic belongings bag sitting on my bedside table and pulled out my corporate tablet. My chest flared with a sharp, dull ache as I propped myself up against the stiff, uncomfortable hospital pillows. But I completely ignored the physical pain. I activated the secure virtual private network and logged directly into my company's highly encrypted financial dashboard using my biometric fingerprint scan. The complex digital interface loaded instantly, displaying the real-time financial ledgers of my entire life's work. I navigated straight to the executive authorization portal, my eyes scanning the active data streams. I knew Kendall lacked the basic discipline to wait until he was safely out of the city. I knew his desperate greed would easily outpace his non-existent strategic planning skills. I refreshed the secure master transaction log. A bold red notification immediately populated at the very top of the glowing screen. Kendall had not even reached the international departure terminal at O'Hare Airport before executing his very first hostile move. He had digitally scanned the forged power of attorney document using his phone and submitted it directly to our primary corporate banking liaison via high-priority email demanding immediate, unrestricted executive access to all company accounts. The bank, seeing the official legal header and recognizing his corporate email address, temporarily granted his profile supreme administrative rights pending a formal secondary review by their legal department. My eyes locked onto the newest financial transaction pending heavily in the outgoing company ledger. Kendall had instantly initiated a massive expedited wire transfer straight out of the company's emergency operational reserve fund. The requested amount was exactly $250,000. He had deliberately categorized the massive cash withdrawal under a highly vague accounting label, marking it in the system as an emergency vendor payment for international freight logistics. He genuinely thought he was being incredibly clever. He arrogantly believed his unearned title as Vice President of Operations gave him the perfect corporate cover to mask his blatant theft from the accounting department. I tapped the pending transaction details, drilling down deeply into the international routing numbers and SWIFT codes. The massive sum of money was not going to a legitimate shipping vendor in Europe or a trusted logistics partner in Asia. The receiving bank account belonged to a newly registered offshore holding company located in the Cayman Islands. It was a shadowy corporate entity I knew for an absolute fact Kendall had personally established late last year after a drunken conversation about tax evasion he foolishly thought I had forgotten. He was not just securing his financial inheritance early. He was actively and maliciously bleeding my company dry while assuming I would either die in this hospital bed or be too physically weak to check the digital books. My own flesh and blood had just committed textbook federal wire fraud using my own corporate infrastructure. I stared at the digital numbers glowing brightly on the screen in the dark room. The initial, crushing sting of their familial betrayal had completely vanished from my system, entirely replaced by the cold, calculated thrill of the impending hunt. I closed the banking application and opened my secure contact list to find my attorney's private number. It was time to initiate Protocol Omega. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound left in my sterile recovery room, and it was entirely too loud for the highly sensitive conversation I needed to have. I reached up to my right index finger and firmly pinched the plastic clamp of the medical pulse oximeter. I slipped it off my finger carefully, placing the glowing red sensor flat against the warm skin of my inner forearm. This simple trick kept the machine reading a steady artificial pulse so the nursing staff at the main station would not rush in to check on me. I needed absolute, impenetrable privacy. I reached for my smartphone and dialed a private number I knew completely by heart. Robert Klein answered on the second ring. Robert was not just my primary corporate attorney. He was a ruthless legal architect who had helped me navigate the vicious underbelly of Chicago commercial real estate and freight logistics for 25 years. He was attending a high society charity gala, judging by the elegant classical music playing softly in the background of the call, but he answered my call immediately. I did not waste his time with pleasantries or medical updates regarding my cardiovascular health. I spoke in a low, measured tone. I told him to activate Protocol Omega. The classical music in the background instantly vanished as Robert stepped out of his crowded gala and into a quiet, secure hallway. Protocol Omega was a scorched earth legal contingency plan Robert and I had designed more than a decade ago. We originally built it to defend my massive logistics empire against aggressive predatory hedge funds attempting hostile corporate takeovers. The protocol was designed to immediately freeze vulnerable assets, lock out unverified executive credentials, and initiate a massive internal financial audit. I never in a million years imagined I would have to deploy this devastating corporate weapon against my own flesh and blood. I gave Robert a rapid, precise briefing of the immediate situation. I explained that my son had just used a temporarily authorized, entirely fraudulent executive profile to wire $250,000 straight out of the company's emergency operational reserve fund. I gave Robert the exact routing numbers showing the massive transfer was heading to an unregistered shell corporation located in the Cayman Islands. Robert immediately offered to contact the primary commercial bank's fraud department to cancel the wire transfer, secure the company funds, and revoke my son's executive access. I told him absolutely not. Stopping the international transfer right now would simply alert my son that I was awake, aware, and actively watching his digital footprint. I wanted the stolen money to move. I wanted him to feel the temporary intoxicating thrill of a successful corporate theft. Instead, I instructed Robert to use his high-level contacts at the Federal Banking Oversight Commission. I wanted him to quietly flag those specific international routing numbers under the Federal Patriot Act for an emergency anti-money laundering review. I knew exactly how the federal financial system operated. Once a suspicious activity report is formally filed by a major banking institution on an offshore transfer of that magnitude, the automated federal algorithms do not just freeze the transferred corporate funds. They automatically and instantly lock down every single domestic bank account, personal credit line, and private investment portfolio associated with the sender's social security number. By the time my arrogant son landed at the airport in Maui and tried to use his platinum card to buy his first expensive resort cocktail, his entire financial existence would be completely paralyzed by the federal government. He would be holding pieces of useless plastic thousands of miles away from home. Robert chuckled darkly on the other end of the line, immediately opening his encrypted laptop to execute the strategic financial strike. Robert typed furiously on his keyboard, initiating the devastating legal maneuvers with his usual clinical precision. I listened to the sharp clacking of the keys, fully expecting him to confirm the federal lockdown was complete in a matter of seconds. Instead, the rapid typing suddenly stopped. A heavy, highly uncomfortable silence filled the secure phone line. Robert possessed a famously calm demeanor. He was a man who regularly negotiated multi-million-dollar union settlements without ever blinking or raising his voice. But when he finally spoke to me, his voice carried a distinct edge of genuine, uncharacteristic alarm. He told me I had a much bigger problem on my hands than simple corporate embezzlement. While scanning the state and medical digital registries to lock down my personal real estate assets, Robert discovered an incoming high-priority legal flag attached directly to my primary medical file. My wife and my son had not just given the commercial bank a forged power of attorney document. Before leaving the hospital for their luxury vacation, my wife had digitally submitted a heavily modified version of that exact same document directly to Dr. Gallagher, my primary care physician of 15 years. I asked Robert to read the attached legal addendum to me over the phone. My blood ran completely cold as I listened to the words. My wife had filed a formal, expedited medical proxy request demanding I be immediately evaluated for advanced rapid-onset cognitive decline. The sheer malice of their coordinated strategy finally crystallized in my mind, hitting me far harder than the actual heart attack. They did not just want temporary control of the logistics company while they lounged on a tropical beach. They were actively executing the very first legal steps to establish a permanent medical conservatorship. I understood the ruthless mechanics of guardianship laws. If a certified hospital doctor signed a piece of paper declaring me mentally incompetent due to the severe physical trauma of the myocardial infarction, my left-handed signature on their forged banking document would not even matter. They would legally own me. Under a permanent conservatorship, I would be instantly reduced to a ward of the state. I would be entirely stripped of my fundamental human right to manage my own corporate money, sell my own real estate properties, or even hire my own defense attorney. I would not be allowed to vote, drive a vehicle, or make a single decision about my own health care. They wanted to erase my legal personhood completely. Their ultimate goal was to lock me away in a secure, high-end nursing facility, dosing me with heavy sedatives, while they systematically dismantled my life's work and liquidated my empire to fund their lavish lifestyle. They were attempting a hostile takeover of my actual brain. Robert urgently advised me to refuse to speak to any hospital staff members. He told me to keep my mouth entirely shut and wait for him to arrive at the hospital with an emergency judicial injunction to block the psychiatric evaluation. He warned me that a hospital psychiatrist could be dispatched to my room at any moment, and anything I said could be aggressively twisted and used against me in a probate courtroom. He promised he was already in his car, speeding toward the downtown medical center. I told him to hurry and disconnected the call. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to slow my racing heart rate. I needed to remain completely calm. A sudden spike in my blood pressure would trigger the bedside alarms and draw unwanted medical attention. I placed my phone back into the clear plastic bag on the bedside table and carefully reattached the pulse oximeter to my index finger. I closed my eyes and began to meticulously review every single financial asset, hidden corporate account, and real estate deed I possessed. I needed to build a mental fortress before the enemy arrived. Before I could even finish securing my mental inventory, the heavy metal handle of my hospital room door slowly turned. The solid door pushed open with a soft click. It was not my friendly night nurse coming to check my intravenous fluid bags. It was not a medical technician coming to draw my blood. A tall, severe-looking man in a crisp, perfectly pressed white medical coat walked purposefully into the dimly lit room. He possessed cold, analytical eyes and carried a thick electronic medical tablet tucked under his arm. He held a small digital voice recorder in his right hand. He stepped up to the edge of my bed, looking down at me as if I were an interesting biological specimen rather than a human being. He introduced himself as the hospital's senior on-call psychiatric evaluator. He stated clearly that he had been ordered directly by my designated medical proxy to formally assess my mental fitness and cognitive awareness. Robert was too late. The legal slaughterhouse had arrived, and the evaluation determining the rest of my natural life was happening right now. The tall psychiatrist standing at the foot of my hospital bed introduced himself as Dr. Mitchell. He clicked the bright red recording button on his digital device and placed it carefully on my tray table. He looked down at me with a practiced, condescending smile. He adopted that distinct, overly gentle tone of voice that medical professionals reserve exclusively for young toddlers and the severely senile. He informed me that my wife had expressed deep, urgent concerns regarding my sudden mental confusion following the cardiac event. I knew exactly how this malicious psychological game was played. If I raised my voice in justified anger, he would document my behavior as aggressive, emotionally unstable, and paranoid. If I refused to answer his insulting questions, he would officially record my silence as severe cognitive decline and total noncompliance. Either reaction would give my family the exact legal ammunition they needed to strip away my human rights and place me under a permanent medical conservatorship. I remained perfectly still against the stiff hospital pillows, keeping my breathing even and my facial expression completely neutral. Dr. Mitchell pulled a pen from his crisp, white coat and asked me to state my full legal name. I answered him in a calm, steady voice. He then asked me if I knew exactly where I was, what day of the week it was, and who the current president of the United States was. These were the standard baseline questions designed to test reality orientation. I answered each one with deliberate clinical precision. His pen scratched lightly against the surface of his electronic tablet. He offered another patronizing smile and leaned forward slightly. He asked me to count backward from 100 by increments of 7. He was trying to test my working memory and basic executive function. I did not give him the satisfaction of playing his elementary school mathematics game. I decided to end the psychiatric duel before he could even finish asking his next question. I looked directly into Dr. Mitchell's cold eyes and completely dismantled his evaluation. I told him my name is Martin Hayes, and my resting heart rate was currently elevated strictly due to a severe myocardial infarction, not cognitive decay. I stated that I am the sole founder and majority shareholder of a regional freight logistics firm headquartered in downtown Chicago. I smoothly recited that my company grossed exactly $84,600,000 in the last fiscal year. I detailed that we currently operate a highly maintained fleet of 412 commercial transport vehicles across 7 Midwestern states. I informed him that our operating profit margin increased by 4.2% last quarter despite a sudden unexpected spike in commercial diesel prices across the national supply chain. I did not pause for a single breath. I watched the condescending smile entirely vanish from Dr. Mitchell's face as I shifted from corporate statistics to aggressive legal reality. I told the doctor I was intimately aware of the exact legal definition of fiduciary duty under Illinois state corporate law. I explained that a designated agent acting under a power of attorney is legally obligated to manage assets strictly for the benefit of the principal. I then explicitly laid out the exact trap my family was attempting to spring. I calmly explained that my wife Cynthia and my son Kendall had just submitted a modified, highly restrictive power of attorney document to my primary care physician. I told Dr. Mitchell they were actively attempting to manufacture a fraudulent medical crisis to establish a permanent conservatorship. I explained their immediate goal was to completely bypass my corporate board of directors, liquidate my commercial assets, and illegally transfer my wealth to offshore accounts, while they vacationed at a luxury resort in Maui. I finished my statement by telling the doctor that if he signed any document declaring me mentally unfit based on my wife's fraudulent claims, my legal team would personally sue him for medical malpractice, gross negligence, and active participation in a federal corporate conspiracy. The heavy silence in the hospital room was absolute. The digital recorder on the tray table continued to quietly track the seconds. Dr. Mitchell stared at me, his pen completely frozen above his tablet. He was an educated man, and he instantly realized he had unknowingly stepped into the middle of a massive, ruthless corporate theft. The patient lying in the bed before him was not a confused, deteriorating old man suffering from dementia. I was a fully coherent, highly dangerous corporate titan who knew exactly how to destroy a career. Dr. Mitchell slowly reached out and pressed the stop button on his digital voice recorder. He cleared his throat nervously, stepping back from the edge of my bed. He tapped his screen rapidly, formally logging his professional medical conclusion. He stated aloud that I possessed exceptional executive function, acute situational awareness, and total cognitive clarity. He officially cleared me of any mental defects and securely signed the digital authorization with his electronic credentials. He politely wished me a swift recovery and quickly exited the room, eager to escape the immense legal liability I had just placed on his shoulders. The heavy door clicked shut behind the psychiatrist, just as it swung open again. A fraction of a second later, Robert Klein, my primary corporate attorney, rushed into my room carrying a thick leather briefcase. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled from his frantic drive across the city. He pulled out a massive stack of freshly printed legal injunctions, fully prepared to physically block the medical staff from conducting the psychiatric evaluation. I raised my left hand, gesturing for him to lower his paperwork. I calmly informed Robert that the evaluation was already over and I had passed with perfect marks. I told him the hospital records now definitively proved I was of entirely sound mind. Robert let out a long, heavy breath of sheer relief, dropping the useless injunctions onto the nearest visitor chair. We had successfully neutralized their most dangerous weapon, but I was not interested in simply playing defense. It was time to permanently secure my vulnerability. I instructed Robert to immediately draft a new, highly ironclad advance healthcare directive and a superseding medical power of attorney. I dictated the exact terms while he typed furiously on his encrypted laptop. I legally revoked any and all medical authority previously granted to my wife, Cynthia. I completely removed her ability to access my medical records, speak to my doctors, or make a single decision regarding my physical body or life support systems. I officially assigned absolute medical proxy rights directly to Robert. I trusted my ruthless corporate lawyer with my actual life far more than I trusted the woman I had slept next to for 35 years. Robert printed the newly drafted legal documents using the secure wireless printer at the hospital nursing station. He brought the crisp papers back to my room along with 2 attending nurses to act as impartial licensed medical witnesses. I took the pen in my right hand this time, ignoring the lingering ache in my chest. I signed my true, legally verified signature with heavy, deliberate strokes. The nurses signed their names, and Robert placed his official notary stamp firmly onto the bottom of the final page. My physical autonomy was officially locked behind a wall of corporate lawyers. Just as the wet ink dried on the final legal seal, the silent screen of my smartphone suddenly lit up on the bedside table. The device vibrated aggressively against the hard plastic surface. I glanced at the caller identification. It was Kendall calling directly from his luxury hotel in Hawaii. He was supposed to be sipping expensive cocktails on a private beach right now. Instead, he was calling me with frantic, desperate persistence. Protocol Omega had successfully hit its designated target. The federal anti-money laundering algorithms had completely paralyzed his financial existence. I looked at Robert, who simply closed his briefcase and offered a cold, knowing smirk. I reached out and picked up the phone. I cleared my throat, instantly dropping my sharp, commanding tone. I softened my voice, taking a shallow, shaky breath to perfectly mimic the sound of a weak, confused, and heavily medicated old man. I swiped the screen to accept the international call. Before I could even say a word, Kendall was already screaming through the receiver. His voice was completely frantic, echoing with public embarrassment as he demanded to know why every single one of his platinum credit cards was suddenly declining at a high-end designer boutique in Maui. The screaming pouring out of the tiny phone speaker was so intensely loud that I actually had to pull the device several inches away from my ear. Kendall was absolutely losing his mind on the other end of the line. He yelled that he was standing squarely in the middle of an exclusive high-end designer boutique on the island of Maui, surrounded by wealthy tourists and incredibly judgmental sales clerks. He angrily informed me that every single one of his platinum corporate credit cards was returning a declined status at the register. He had attempted to purchase several $1,000s worth of imported watches and luxury resort wear, only to be publicly humiliated when the electronic payment terminal repeatedly rejected his signature. He blamed me entirely for this massive social embarrassment. He aggressively demanded that I immediately contact the primary commercial bank, override the security freeze, and personally authorize his luxury purchases. I took a slow, shallow breath, intentionally allowing my chest to rattle slightly against the phone microphone. I made my voice sound incredibly raspy, weak, and profoundly frail. I told him I simply did not understand what was happening with the corporate accounts. I told him my chest still hurt terribly from the massive myocardial infarction, and the hospital doctors had me heavily medicated on powerful intravenous narcotics. I played the role of the pathetic, confused, deteriorating old man with absolute flawless perfection. I softly suggested the federal bank might have simply flagged his international charges because they knew I was lying in a hospital bed and they highly suspected fraudulent offshore activity. Instead of expressing a single ounce of sympathy or basic human understanding for my critical medical state, Kendall let out a vicious string of hateful curses. He called me a useless old fool and screamed that my incompetence was deliberately ruining their meticulously planned family vacation. He did not ask if my heart rate had stabilized. He did not ask if I was going to survive the night. He simply slammed the phone down, abruptly ending the call. He hung up on his father, entirely furious that his endless stream of free corporate money had suddenly hit an unexpected dry spell. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the hard plastic tray table beside my bed. The frail, confused old man act instantly vanished from my posture and my mind. I sat up straighter against the stiff hospital pillows, ignoring the dull, persistent ache radiating across my sternum. My mind was sharp, clear, and highly calculating. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of my son. I had written massive six-figure checks to fully fund his prestigious Ivy League education on the East Coast. I paid his exorbitant tuition entirely in cash every single semester, so he would never have to know the crushing, suffocating weight of student loan debt. I bought him a luxury condominium near the university campus, so he would not have to endure the basic indignity of sharing a crowded dormitory with normal students. I gave him every single advantage a father could possibly provide to ensure his professional success. Despite all that elite education, the expensive textbooks, and the top-tier networking events, Kendall never bothered to learn the fundamental principles of basic corporate accounting. He possessed a master's degree in business administration, yet he genuinely did not understand how corporate financial reserves or federal banking regulations actually functioned in the real world. He viewed our corporate wealth as a magical bottomless well that simply existed to automatically fund his endless desires. He never once looked at the quarterly ledgers. He never understood the sheer volume of sweat, blood, and strategic violence required to maintain a massive logistics empire in the highly competitive Midwest market. I remember driving freight trucks through blinding snowstorms for 48 hours straight just to secure our first major commercial contract. Kendall knew absolutely nothing of that world. He was nothing more than a spoiled boy playing dress-up in a tailored Italian suit, wholly dependent on the very man he was actively trying to legally destroy. It was time to give my entitled son his very first real-world lesson in absolute corporate finance. I picked up my secure tablet again and navigated straight to the executive banking portal. I bypassed the standard authorization screens using my biometric fingerprint scan and administrative override codes. I pulled up the primary corporate credit accounts permanently assigned to both Kendall and his sister Jasmine. They had treated these accounts like their personal piggy banks for over a decade, casually charging expensive steakhouse dinners, luxury vehicle leases, and exclusive private club memberships under the fraudulent guise of client entertainment and corporate networking. With 3 quick, highly decisive taps on the glowing glass screen, I officially severed their financial lifelines. I did not just lower their daily spending limits. I reduced their available balances to 0 and permanently revoked their cardholder privileges across the entire banking network. I was not nearly finished with them. I opened the master corporate accounting software and pulled up the detailed expense report for their current Hawaiian vacation. Kendall had brazenly coded the entire $85,000 luxury trip as an annual executive corporate retreat. He was completely writing off their first-class flights, 5-star resort cabanas, private boat charters, and expensive tropical meals as legitimate business expenses to avoid paying corporate taxes. I digitally struck a heavy red line through the official classification. I manually reclassified every single penny of that $85,000. I officially designated the entire massive amount as a personal taxable shareholder loan issued directly from the logistics company to Kendall and Jasmine as private individuals. By legally altering this specific internal classification, I had just triggered an automatic reporting requirement directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Our automated accounting system would instantly generate tax forms reflecting this massive transfer of personal wealth. They did not just owe my company the money back. They now owed the federal government massive, unavoidable taxes on undeclared personal income. If they failed to report this newly classified loan on their next personal tax return, it would instantly trigger a devastating federal audit for corporate embezzlement and tax evasion. I digitally signed the ledger update with my secure executive credentials and permanently locked the file against any future internal modifications. I took a brief moment to drink some cold water from the plastic cup on my bedside table, feeling a deep, profound sense of strategic satisfaction. The financial noose was officially tightening securely around their necks, and they were thousands of miles away, entirely powerless to stop the legal machinery I had set in motion. Then a highly distinct, sharp chime echoed loudly from my tablet. It was not a standard banking notification or a typical corporate email alert. It was a severe, urgent security warning triggered directly by my private encrypted cloud storage network. I opened the master security dashboard and immediately analyzed the incoming data logs streaming rapidly across the screen. Someone was actively attempting to breach my personal digital vault. The advanced security system successfully traced the hostile internet protocol address straight back to the exact luxury resort in Maui where my family was currently staying. I checked the specific device identification profile attached to the hostile login attempts. It was not Kendall or Cynthia trying to blindly guess my passwords. The digital signature belonged exclusively to Ethan, my completely useless son-in-law. Ethan was a chronically failed technology entrepreneur who had spent the last 5 agonizing years constantly begging me to invest my hard-earned money into his terrible, doomed software startup ideas. He had always arrogantly believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered, constantly looking down on my blue-collar logistics background despite living entirely off my wealth. Operating under the absolute foolish assumption that I was physically incapacitated and heavily sedated in the intensive care unit, Ethan was secretly launching a brute force cyber attack against my personal private servers. I watched the live security logs as he aggressively tried to bypass my 2-factor authentication protocols using automated password recovery loopholes. He was not aiming for my corporate bank accounts or the logistics company files. He was specifically targeting the highly restricted digital folder containing the master passwords and original legal deeds to our family's entire joint real estate portfolio. He was trying to digitally steal the legal documentation for our 10,000 square foot primary mansion, our commercial real estate lots, and my private investment properties. He wanted complete unrestricted control of the family estate before I even had the chance to draw my final breath in this hospital. I watched the glowing security logs scroll relentlessly down my encrypted tablet screen, tracking every single pathetic keystroke Ethan made from his luxury hotel room in Hawaii. He was aggressively running an automated password cracking script he had likely purchased on the dark web, entirely convinced he was a sophisticated technological genius. He fundamentally misunderstood both the complexity of my digital infrastructure and the sheer depth of my professional paranoia. I had anticipated a direct digital breach the exact moment the paramedics strapped me to the stretcher in my office. Hours before my useless son-in-law even connected his imported laptop to the expensive resort Wi-Fi network, I had permanently locked down the master cloud server. I instituted a hard military-grade encrypted firewall that required physical biometric authentication from my personal devices to access any corporate or legal documents. I sat back against the stiff hospital pillows and watched his digital attacks bounce harmlessly off my servers like rain against reinforced glass. Ethan was specifically trying to steal the original deeds to our family real estate portfolio, along with my private estate planning documents and the master trust certificates. He genuinely believed that if he could digitally secure the underlying paperwork, he could illegally leverage the properties to fund his chronically failing software startup or secure a massive unsecured line of credit from a predatory lender. The sheer audacity of his clumsy cyber attack triggered a completely new, profound realization in my strategic planning. Cutting off their corporate credit cards was simply a temporary surface-level inconvenience. Taking away their ability to buy designer clothes, order expensive tropical cocktails, and fund their lavish social lives would not break their deeply ingrained arrogance. They would simply wait for me to die and claim their inheritance. To truly reset the balance of power and inflict a permanent lesson, I needed to completely destroy their physical foundation. I needed to pull the very ground they walked on right out from under their feet. My family lived in a sprawling 10,000 square foot colonial mansion located in one of the most exclusive, heavily guarded, gated communities in the wealthy Chicago suburbs. Cynthia treated that massive estate as her absolute personal kingdom. She hosted extravagant, highly publicized charity galas, and the grand ballroom paraded her wealthy, superficial friends through the meticulously manicured English gardens, and constantly bragged to anyone who would listen about the custom Italian marble floors I had specially imported for the grand foyer. She confidently assumed the estate was a protected marital asset, perfectly split down the middle if we ever filed for divorce, or entirely hers the moment my heart stopped beating. She was entirely wrong on all counts. 30 years ago, when I first purchased that massive plot of land and began construction, I deliberately did not place her name on the original property deed. Using the highly legitimate excuse of necessary corporate liability protection, I placed the entire physical property into a blind, irrevocable, limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. I was the absolute sole managing member and exclusive shareholder of that corporate entity. Cynthia had blindly signed the legal waivers and spousal relinquishment forms 3 decades ago without ever bothering to read the fine print or consult her own legal counsel. She owned absolutely nothing but the expensive clothes hanging in her massive walk-in closet. The mansion was entirely mine to sell, liquidate, or completely demolish at my absolute discretion. I closed the security dashboard and opened my highly secure encrypted contact list, deliberately bypassing my standard corporate communications network. I needed someone who moved incredibly fast in the real estate sector, someone who did not rely on traditional bank financing, lengthy home inspections, or tedious municipal appraisals. I found the private cellular number for Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not a traditional smiling real estate agent who hosted weekend open houses. He was a highly aggressive elite wholesale property buyer who specialized exclusively in securing distressed luxury assets for international cash investors. He operated entirely in the lucrative shadows of the Chicago real estate market, moving tens of millions of dollars with a single text message and a handshake. I opened a new encrypted message thread and typed a direct, entirely unsentimental offer. I told Jonathan I was liquidating my primary suburban estate immediately due to an internal corporate restructuring maneuver. The property was recently appraised by the county at slightly over $4 million. I explicitly offered him the entire estate, including all permanent custom fixtures, for a heavily discounted price of $2.8 million in cold, untraceable corporate cash. I intentionally chose that exact number because it fell precisely within his known immediate liquidity threshold. I added one absolute non-negotiable condition to the massive financial discount. I demanded a complete, legally binding closing and the absolute transfer of funds within exactly 72 hours. The response from Jonathan did not take days or even hours. Exactly 4 minutes later, my tablet buzzed quietly in my hands. Jonathan simply requested the current legal address and the federal tax identification number for the holding company. I sent the requested data instantly without a single word of elaboration. I knew he was currently running a rapid, comprehensive background check, pulling high-resolution satellite imagery and verifying the municipal tax records to ensure the massive property was entirely free of secondary contractor liens or complex legal encumbrances. I watched the typing indicator bubble flash rapidly on the screen. Jonathan was a ruthless negotiator, and he knew a $2.8 million cash offer for a pristine $4 million estate was an absolute undeniable steal. It was the exact kind of massive profit margin that made entire careers in his cutthroat industry. 10 minutes later, my screen lit up with a firm, legally binding agreement. He stated his private equity firm would wire the entire $2.8 million directly into my secure corporate escrow account by Friday morning at the absolute latest. However, Jonathan immediately countered with a severe, highly complicated logistical demand of his own to protect his investment. Because he was rapidly flipping the massive property directly to a wealthy foreign investor who was flying into the city this coming weekend, the mansion could not simply be sold on paper with existing occupants. Jonathan demanded that the entire 10,000 square foot estate be delivered in pristine, broom-swept condition. Every single piece of furniture, every personal item, and every single trace of my family had to be completely removed from the premises. The physical alarm codes had to be reset. The master keys had to be surrendered to his private courier, and the massive property had to be entirely vacant by exactly noon on Friday. He bluntly stated that if a single designer couch or expensive painting was left inside the house, the entire cash deal would instantly collapse, and he would tie the property up in endless legal litigation for breach of contract. I stared closely at the bright screen, doing the complicated mental math in my head while my heart monitor beeped steadily in the background. It was currently late Tuesday night in Chicago. Cynthia, Kendall, Jasmine, and Ethan were scheduled to return from their luxurious, fraudulently funded Hawaiian vacation early Saturday morning. I had just legally sold their beloved, impenetrable sanctuary right out from under their feet. But to secure the cash and make the digital eviction totally permanent, I had to physically empty a massive multi-level mansion filled to the brim with 35 years of accumulated wealth, heavy custom furniture, and endless personal possessions. I had exactly 60 hours to orchestrate one of the most complex, massive residential moves in the history of the city. I could not simply call a standard commercial moving company and ask them to casually pack up the house over the weekend. A standard hourly crew would take weeks to properly catalog, box, and transport that immense volume of luxury goods. More importantly, I had to accomplish this massive logistical nightmare while remaining physically confined to a highly monitored hospital bed in the intensive care cardiac unit. If any of Cynthia's nosy, wealthy neighbors caught wind of a massive fleet of moving trucks descending upon the estate, they would instantly call the local police and claim a massive coordinated robbery was in progress. They would alert my family, and the entire silent operation would be violently exposed before the ink on the digital contract could even dry. I locked my tablet screen and took a deep, steadying breath, ignoring the sharp pain in my ribs. I needed a highly specialized team. I needed a corporate relocation crew that operated with absolute military precision, total discretion, and unquestioning loyalty to the person signing their checks. The digital war was officially over, and the highly complicated physical extraction was about to begin. I did not open a public directory to search for local moving companies. I reached out to a private, highly specialized corporate extraction firm based out of Detroit. I had utilized their discreet services a decade ago during a particularly hostile corporate acquisition, and I knew they operated with absolute ruthless efficiency. I sent a secure message to their chief operations officer, outlining the massive scale of the residential job and the impossible deadline. I authorized a triple premium rush fee to guarantee their immediate deployment. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, a fleet of 6 unmarked heavy-duty commercial moving trucks quietly bypassed the main security gates of my affluent neighborhood using the master vendor override codes I provided. The extraction team seamlessly disabled the primary perimeter alarms, bypassed the exterior security cameras, and unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors of my mansion without making a single sound. I lay awake in my hospital bed, ignoring the dull throb in my healing chest, watching the live feeds from the internal security cameras on my encrypted tablet as 30 men dressed in black uniforms flooded into my home. The operation was highly synchronized and executed with military precision. I spoke directly into my secure headset, giving precise, real-time instructions to the extraction foreman, a massive, no-nonsense professional named Miller. I directed his primary team to my private study on the ground floor. I ordered them to carefully pack all my physical financial ledgers, my secure hard drives, and the original oil paintings I had purchased from local African-American artists over the decades. I instructed them to gently wrap my late mother's antique mantel clocks and transport all my personal belongings to a highly secure, climate-controlled private vault located deep beneath the downtown financial district. My personal legacy was being actively preserved and protected. The instructions for the rest of the massive estate were entirely different. I directed the secondary crews to the master suite and the upper guest wings. I ordered them to aggressively pack every single one of Cynthia's imported Italian leather handbags, her extensive collection of designer shoes, and her incredibly expensive winter furs. I had them pack Kendall's custom golf clubs and Jasmine's excessive jewelry collections into standard unmarked cardboard boxes. These boxes were not heading to the secure downtown vault. I had prepaid for a massive, highly neglected commercial storage unit located in a rundown industrial park on the far south side of the city. The facility lacked basic climate control security patrols and overhead lighting. I registered the cheap unit under a completely untraceable corporate shell name. Cynthia had spent the last 30 years absolutely obsessing over the precise humidity levels in her custom closets, constantly terrified that seasonal moisture would ruin her precious fabrics. Now her entire manufactured identity was going to bake inside a sweltering, unventilated tin box sitting directly next to a noisy freight train rail yard. To ensure the absolute vacancy of the property demanded by my cash buyer, I ordered the extraction team to clear the massive garage. They loaded Kendall's luxury sports cars and Cynthia's premium imported SUV onto heavy flatbed trailers and parked them inside the same dusty industrial lot. Every single piece of heavy custom furniture, every expensive Persian rug, and every crystal chandelier they had purchased with my corporate money was systematically dismantled, wrapped, and hauled away. By Thursday evening, the 10,000-square-foot estate was nearly empty. The house echoed with a hollow, profound emptiness that perfectly mirrored the absolute death of my marriage. The physical manifestation of their unearned arrogance was being entirely erased from the map. I was just about to disconnect the live audio feed and attempt to get some much-needed physical rest when Miller's deep voice crackled urgently over the secure communication line. He informed me that his final sweep crew had discovered a major structural anomaly in the master bedroom. While pulling up the heavy custom-built mahogany shelving units inside Cynthia's massive walk-in closet to ensure the walls were bare, they uncovered a false floorboard. Beneath the polished hardwood, they found a heavy, professional-grade biometric floor safe bolted directly into the concrete foundation of the house. I stared at the live video feed on my tablet, completely stunned by the visual confirmation. I had personally overseen the original architectural construction of that mansion 30 years ago. I knew every single wire pipe and hidden crawl space in that building. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of this hidden safe. Cynthia had secretly hired private contractors behind my back to alter the physical foundation of our home. I did not hesitate for a single second. I explicitly ordered Miller to breach the vault. He warned me that drilling a commercial-grade biometric safe would completely destroy the locking mechanism and create a massive amount of noise that could potentially alert the wealthy neighbors. I told him I did not care if he had to use industrial thermite or heavy explosives to open the steel box. I stayed on the secure line listening to the high-pitched, agonizing whine of a heavy-duty diamond-tipped drill biting into thick, reinforced steel. The tedious drilling process took 2 agonizing hours. My chest physically ached with the rising tension, but I absolutely refused to look away from the tablet screen. Finally, a heavy metallic clank echoed through the audio feed. Miller announced the internal locking pins had successfully dropped. I ordered the foreman to step back and aim his high-definition body camera directly into the dark cavity of the breached floor safe. I genuinely expected to see stacks of hidden cash she had slowly siphoned from our joint accounts, secret offshore bank account ledgers, or perhaps expensive jewelry she had hoarded away for herself in case of a divorce. What I actually saw was infinitely worse. There was absolutely no money inside the vault. There was only a thick, professionally bound legal dossier resting at the bottom of the cold steel box. I ordered Miller to put on protective gloves, carefully extract the documents, and scan every single page directly to my secure server using his portable high-resolution scanner. The encrypted files populated on my tablet screen seconds later. I zoomed in on the official letterhead of the primary document. It was a formal, heavily negotiated contract between my wife and the chief executive officer of a massive rival logistics conglomerate based in New York. The documents outlined a comprehensive, multi-million-dollar hostile takeover strategy. Cynthia had signed an ironclad legal agreement promising to leverage her expected medical conservatorship over me to forcefully sell my entire freight empire to my biggest competitor at a tiny fraction of its actual market value. In exchange for entirely betraying my life's work and dismantling the company I built from nothing, the rival corporation had legally guaranteed her a massive 8-figure cash payout and a permanent silent seat on their corporate board of directors. The signatures on the document were dated exactly 8 months ago. She was not just a greedy, superficial wife waiting for her sick husband to die so she could inherit a fortune. She was an active, malicious corporate saboteur who had spent the better part of a year meticulously plotting the complete and total destruction of my legacy. She had smiled in my face, slept in my bed, and eaten at my dinner table while secretly negotiating my professional execution with my fiercest business rivals. The sheer calculated scale of her betrayal demanded an entirely new level of strategic retaliation. Evicting her from the house and cutting off her unlimited credit cards was no longer nearly enough. I needed to annihilate her entirely. I needed to ensure that when she finally returned from Hawaii, she would have absolutely nothing left to her name, not even the illusion of power. I locked the scanned documents into my secure digital vault and immediately drafted an emergency email to my corporate board of directors to initiate the final phase of my counterattack. I stared at the scanned pages of the hostile takeover agreement glowing brightly on my encrypted tablet screen, my mind racing through the complex legal implications. Cynthia and Kendall had not just negotiated a massive payout for themselves. They had structured the illicit deal to actively trigger crippling penalty clauses against my logistics company the very moment the corporate transfer was finalized. The competitor they were selling me out to was specifically acquiring my firm just to strip its valuable assets, dissolve the existing union contracts, and permanently eliminate the brand I had spent my entire adult life building from the ground up. My own flesh and blood had sold my professional soul for 30 pieces of silver. I could not simply fire Kendall and Jasmine from their high-ranking executive positions. I had foolishly structured their original employment contracts years ago when I still blindly trusted them. Their contracts included ironclad golden parachute severance clauses. If I terminated them without legally proving gross negligence in a court of law, a process that would take months and cost millions in legal fees, the company would be legally obligated to pay them 3 years of their massive executive salaries in full, plus guaranteed stock options. I refused to hand them another single dime of my money as a reward for their ultimate betrayal. I needed a structural loophole, a corporate maneuver so massive and legally complex that their lucrative executive contracts would simply cease to exist. I disconnected the secure communication line with the extraction team foreman and immediately dialed Robert Klein's private number again. It was just past 4 in the morning, but my attorney answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and alert. I sent him the scanned documents from the hidden safe. I listened to his low, incredulous whistle as he rapidly processed the sheer scale of the legal treachery Cynthia had orchestrated. I told Robert that defending our corporate borders was no longer a viable long-term strategy. I was tired of fighting off predators, both external competitors and internal family members. It was time to completely alter the commercial landscape. I ordered Robert to immediately contact the global acquisition team at Apex International. Apex was a massive, publicly traded European conglomerate that had aggressively tried to acquire my regional logistics firm 3 times in the last decade. I had always stubbornly refused their incredibly lucrative offers, deeply preferring to keep my company an independent family-owned business. The illusion of that family business was now entirely dead. I instructed Robert to accept Apex's last standing acquisition offer, but with one critical, highly irregular modification. I did not want a standard corporate buyout where Apex simply purchased my shares and absorbed my company. I wanted an immediate, aggressive structural merger. By legally merging my logistics firm into the massive Apex International corporate structure, my original company would technically cease to exist as an independent legal entity. All existing employee contracts, vendor agreements, and executive roles would be immediately subjected to Apex's rigid corporate restructuring protocols. Robert understood my strategy instantly. He began drafting the preliminary merger documents while we were still on the phone. Because I still retained 85% of the voting shares in my company, I did not need approval from Kendall Jasmine or the board of directors to unilaterally execute the merger. The logistics company was a private dictatorship, and I was the absolute dictator. The ensuing 48 hours were a chaotic blur of intense legal maneuvering, secure video conferences with European corporate executives, and massive digital document transfers, all conducted from the confines of my hospital bed. Apex International was incredibly eager to finally secure my highly profitable Midwestern freight routes, and they moved with terrifying corporate speed. By early Friday morning, the massive structural merger was officially finalized and legally filed with the federal regulatory agencies. My life's work was now entirely absorbed into a global machine. The immediate corporate consequences were exactly as I had calculated. When a corporate merger of this magnitude is officially executed, redundant executive positions are instantly eliminated to optimize operational efficiency. Apex International already possessed a massive, highly competent executive team located in Europe. They absolutely did not need a lazy vice president of operations who rarely showed up to the office, or a vice president of marketing who treated company funds like a personal allowance. Because my original company was legally dissolved in the merger, Kendall and Jasmine were not technically fired. Their specific employment roles were simply eliminated due to massive corporate restructuring. The golden parachute severance clauses in their contracts were entirely nullified by the structural change. They were officially unemployed, completely cut off from the corporate payroll, and legally entitled to absolutely nothing. While the ink was drying on the massive multi-million-dollar merger documents in Chicago, my family was enjoying their final full day in the tropical paradise of Maui. I imagined them lounging on the pristine white sand, completely oblivious to the absolute financial devastation I had just unleashed upon their lives. I opened the master administrative portal for the newly merged corporate email servers. The Apex Information Technology Department had already initiated the massive digital migration process. I watched with profound satisfaction as the active employee status indicators next to Kendall and Jasmine's names suddenly switched from a bright active green to a dead inactive gray. I imagined the exact moment it happened. Perhaps Kendall was trying to send an arrogant email to an administrative assistant back in Chicago demanding they arrange a luxury car service to pick them up from the airport. Perhaps Jasmine was trying to log into the corporate expense account to falsely categorize a massive dinner bill. Whatever they were doing, their digital access was instantly and permanently severed. Their corporate email accounts were completely wiped. Their digital security credentials were automatically revoked. They were entirely locked out of the system. I did not have to wait long to see the physical results of their digital exile. My encrypted tablet buzzed with an incoming text message from a former senior manager who had survived the corporate restructuring. The message contained a frantic, highly confused email Kendall had desperately sent from his personal, unsecured email address to the general human resources inbox. He was demanding to know why his corporate login credentials were suddenly rejecting his passwords. He arrogantly threatened to personally fire the entire IT department the moment he returned from Hawaii. The human resources representative, fully briefed by the Apex transition team, replied with a standard cold corporate form letter. They formally informed Kendall that his position had been eliminated due to the recent structural merger and requested he immediately return all corporate property, including laptops, tablets, and vehicles. The absolute panic must have set in instantly. Kendall was trapped thousands of miles away from home. His credit cards were completely frozen by the federal government. His personal bank accounts were locked under the anti-money laundering review, and he had just been officially informed that he no longer had a high-paying executive job. He had absolutely no incoming salary, no corporate expense accounts to abuse, and no legal standing to fight the massive merger. The intricate, comfortable web of nepotism and stolen wealth they had relied on for their entire adult lives was completely destroyed. I locked my tablet and carefully set it on the bedside table. The intense, high-stakes corporate warfare of the last few days had taken a severe physical toll on my healing body. My chest ached with a deep, throbbing exhaustion, but my mind was incredibly peaceful. The surgical extraction of my toxic family from my financial empire was finally complete. The massive 10,000-square-foot mansion in the suburbs was completely empty and legally sold to a cash buyer. The logistics company I had built was safely merged into an untouchable global conglomerate. My personal wealth and legacy assets were locked securely behind impenetrable legal trusts. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to truly rest for the very first time since the paramedics rushed me into the emergency room. I knew exactly what was coming next. My arrogant, entitled family was scheduled to board their long flight back to Chicago tomorrow morning. They were returning home entirely expecting to resume their luxurious, comfortable lives while casually finalizing my legal conservatorship. They had absolutely no idea they were flying straight into a solid brick wall of reality. The silent phase of my retaliation was officially over. The brutal, highly visible consequences of their greed were about to begin. The morning sun rose over the pristine beaches of Maui, casting a golden light over the luxury resort where my family had spent the last 6 days living like absolute royalty on my stolen dime. I knew the exact timeline of their impending destruction because I had personally contacted the resort's general manager the night before. I had formally notified the hotel that the corporate card on file was strictly invalid and actively under federal investigation for wire fraud. I specifically requested that the management team treat the final checkout process with extreme, uncompromising financial prejudice. Through the detailed incident report and the security footage the manager later forwarded directly to my encrypted tablet, I watched the arrogant facade of my family completely disintegrate in real time. It was shortly before 11 in the morning when Cynthia, Kendall, Jasmine, Megan, and Ethan confidently strolled into the open-air, marble-lined lobby of the five-star resort. They were heavily tanned, completely relaxed, and dressed in freshly purchased designer resort wear. A team of uniformed bellhops trailed behind them, pushing heavy brass luggage carts piled high with their matching imported suitcases. They approached the VIP concierge desk with the casual, entitled swagger of people who genuinely believed the entire world owed them a luxurious living. Cynthia slid her oversized sunglasses to the top of her head and aggressively snapped her fingers to get the immediate attention of the front desk manager. She demanded their final folio, casually mentioning they had a first-class flight to catch back to Chicago. The manager, a seasoned professional who had already been thoroughly briefed on the explosive situation, maintained a perfectly polite, icy demeanor. He printed out the heavily itemized final bill and placed it on the mahogany counter. The grand total for the remaining balance was a staggering $40,000. This massive sum covered their daily room service of imported caviar, the premium vintage champagne they had ordered to their private beachside cabanas, their extensive deep tissue spa treatments, and the exorbitant late checkout fees. Cynthia did not even bother to look at the massive number printed on the paper. She simply waved her manicured hand and arrogantly instructed the manager to charge the entire balance to the corporate black card they had placed on file at the beginning of the week. The manager typed a few commands into his terminal and calmly informed her that the corporate account was permanently closed. He stated clearly that the financial institution had issued a hard decline code explicitly refusing to authorize any further charges. Cynthia let out a harsh, condescending laugh, loudly complaining about the sheer incompetence of the hotel staff. She ordered Kendall to hand over his secondary platinum card. Kendall smugly pulled the heavy metal card from his expensive leather wallet and tossed it onto the counter. The manager swiped the card. The terminal beeped with a sharp negative tone. Declined. Jasmine stepped forward, visibly annoyed, and offered her own corporate card. Declined. Ethan, trying to play the heroic son-in-law, pulled out his personal high-interest credit card. Declined. The smug, arrogant expressions vanished from their tanned faces, instantly replaced by a creeping, cold sense of absolute panic. Megan Kendall's deeply materialistic wife loudly demanded to know what was going on, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet, elegant lobby. Other wealthy guests began to turn and stare at the escalating commotion. The hotel manager leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the counter. He dropped his polite hospitality tone and explicitly informed them that every single financial instrument they had presented was completely frozen. He then delivered the ultimate ultimatum. He told them they owed the resort exactly $40,000 payable immediately in cash or certified funds. If they attempted to leave the hotel property without settling the massive debt, he would instantly contact the Maui Police Department and press felony charges against all 5 of them for defrauding an innkeeper, a severe criminal offense in the state of Hawaii. They were officially held hostage by their own excessive greed. Cynthia snatched her smartphone from her designer purse, her hands shaking with a mixture of intense rage and sudden fear. She dialed my personal cell phone number, fully intending to scream at me and demand I immediately call the bank to clear the security freeze. She pressed the phone to her ear. She did not hear my voice. She did not even hear a standard voicemail greeting. She heard a cold, automated operator message stating that her specific phone number had been permanently blocked by the network administrator. I had restricted all of their devices the moment the corporate merger was finalized. Panic officially took over. Kendall pushed his mother aside and dialed the direct priority phone line for the Human Resources Department at my logistics company in Chicago. He fully expected to reach our timid, long-suffering Human Resources Director whom he regularly bullied. Instead, the call was answered by a stern, highly efficient woman speaking with a crisp European accent. Kendall aggressively demanded to know why his corporate cards were locked and ordered her to authorize the massive hotel payment immediately. He shouted that he was the vice president of operations and threatened to fire her on the spot. The woman on the other end of the line did not flinch. She calmly introduced herself as a senior transition officer for Apex International, calling directly from the global headquarters in Geneva. She coldly informed Kendall that the regional logistics firm he was referencing no longer existed as an independent commercial entity. She stated that the massive structural merger had been legally finalized at midnight. She then delivered the fatal blow. She informed Kendall that his executive position, along with Jasmine's role, had been permanently eliminated during the mandatory corporate restructuring process. She firmly advised him that he was no longer an employee, he had absolutely no authorization to use corporate funds, and any further attempt to access company accounts would be heavily prosecuted as criminal fraud by Apex International's global legal team. She abruptly disconnected the call. Kendall dropped his phone onto the marble counter, his face completely drained of color. He looked at his mother, his sister, and his wife, absolutely speechless. The reality of their total financial annihilation crashed down on them in the middle of a tropical paradise. They were thousands of miles away from home, stripped of their executive titles, locked out of their bank accounts, and facing immediate felony arrest if they tried to walk out the front door of the hotel. Megan began to cry hysterically loudly, blaming Kendall for the entire disastrous situation. Ethan paced back and forth across the lobby, desperately trying to log into his locked cloud servers on his phone, completely unaware that I had already sold the primary mansion they planned to use as collateral. Cynthia, however, possessed a deeply ingrained venomous survival instinct. She refused to accept absolute defeat. She suddenly remembered the heavy manila envelope tucked safely inside her designer handbag. She had the forged temporary power of attorney document I had signed with my left hand in the hospital room. She genuinely believed that piece of paper still granted her supreme legal authority over my entire estate. She turned to the hotel manager and haughtily demanded a brief 1-hour extension to settle the massive bill. She left her children and their spouses sitting helplessly on their expensive luggage in the lobby as physical collateral and marched out to the hotel driveway. She ordered a local taxi, directing the driver to take her to the largest commercial bank branch on the island. Cynthia walked into the Hawaiian bank branch with her head held high, radiating absolute false confidence. She bypassed the standard teller lines and demanded an immediate emergency meeting with the senior branch manager. Sitting in the manager's plush office, she spun a rapid, highly dramatic lie. She claimed her husband had suffered a sudden medical emergency back in Chicago, and she desperately needed to secure a short-term $50,000 personal loan against his massive commercial real estate portfolio to cover emergency transportation costs. She confidently slid the forged power of attorney document across the heavy wooden desk, expecting the manager to immediately authorize the massive cash withdrawal based on my exceptional credit history. The branch manager reviewed the legal document carefully. He excused himself from the office, claiming he simply needed to run the paperwork through the federal banking verification system to authorize the out-of-state transaction. Cynthia sat comfortably in the leather chair, crossing her legs, entirely convinced she had successfully outsmarted the system. She waited for 10 minutes. The heavy office door finally opened. The branch manager did not return with a stack of fresh cash or a cashier's check. He walked back into the room, accompanied by 2 large, stern-looking armed bank security guards. The manager placed the power of attorney document back on the desk, but he kept his hand firmly over it. He looked at Cynthia with absolute professional disdain. He informed her that the exact legal instrument she had just presented was flagged in the National Banking Database by the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 48 hours ago. Because Robert had initiated Protocol Omega, the forged document was legally classified as an active component in a federal wire fraud investigation. The manager explicitly told Cynthia that attempting to use a federally flagged fraudulent legal instrument to secure a cash loan across state lines was a severe federal offense. He pointed directly toward the glass doors of the bank lobby. He told Cynthia that if she did not stand up, walk out of his bank, and leave the property immediately, he would instruct his security team to detain her while he contacted the federal authorities. Cynthia stared at the armed guards, her carefully constructed, arrogant facade finally cracking into a million irreparable pieces. She realized she had walked straight into a perfectly executed legal slaughterhouse. She slowly stood up from the leather chair, her hands shaking violently, and walked out of the bank with absolutely nothing. She stood alone on the hot Hawaiian sidewalk, completely broke, legally paralyzed, and surrounded by an ocean she could not afford to cross. The trap was absolutely airtight. They were totally stranded. The Maui sun was merciless as they stood outside the luxury resort, fully comprehending the magnitude of their entrapment. The hotel manager had given them precisely 3 hours to produce $40,000 in cash before he dialed the local authorities. There was no secret offshore account they could magically access, no wealthy friends they could casually call who would not immediately question why their platinum cards were failing. They were forced to endure the ultimate crushing humiliation for people entirely obsessed with high society status. They had to pawn their manufactured identities. Cynthia, Kendall, Jasmine, Megan, and Ethan piled into a dilapidated local taxi and directed the driver to a seedy commercial strip mall several miles away from the pristine tourist beaches. They walked into a cramped, heavily barred pawn shop, smelling of stale cigarette smoke dust and sheer desperation. The stark contrast between the sparkling resort lobby and this grim reality was absolute. Cynthia was forced to unclip her massive diamond tennis bracelet and physically slide her imported Italian leather handbags across the scratched glass counter. Kendall unbuckled his heavy gold Rolex watch, the exact same premium timepiece he had arrogantly checked while standing next to my hospital bed just 6 days prior. Jasmine and Megan surrendered their custom engagement rings and premium diamond earrings. The pawnshop owner, a deeply cynical man who regularly preyed on desperate, overextended tourists, offered them a brutally insulting fraction of the actual retail value. They had absolutely no leverage to negotiate a better rate. They took the crumpled stacks of cash, their hands shaking with suppressed rage and profound disbelief. They returned to the resort silently counting out the thick stacks of $100 bills on the marble concierge desk. The hotel manager issued a cold, printed receipt and ordered his private security team to escort them entirely off the private property. They were officially homeless in a tropical paradise. They used the meager remaining cash from the pawn shop to purchase the only airline tickets they could afford at the very last minute. There were no private jet charters or spacious first-class cabins waiting for them. They bought 5 middle-seat basic economy tickets on a grueling red-eye commercial flight back to Chicago. The airport terminal was a brutal physical shock to their fragile, pampered nervous systems. They were forced to stand in the massive winding security lines with the general public dragging the few heavy suitcases they had not sold for cash. They boarded the massive commercial airliner in the very last boarding group, shuffling down the narrow, cramped aisles toward the extreme back of the plane. They were seated in the final 2 rows directly next to the noisy, high-traffic lavatories. The distinct smell of cheap airplane food, heavy chemical disinfectant, and recycled cabin air hit them immediately. As the plane taxied down the long runway, the sheer physical discomfort of the tight, heavily worn fabric seats began to aggressively break their spirits. Megan Kendall's deeply materialistic wife lasted exactly 45 minutes before she started to loudly and incessantly complain. She whined about the severe lack of legroom, the crying infant in the row directly ahead of them, and the absolute indignity of flying like a common peasant. She directed her entire venomous tirade squarely at me, loudly declaring that her cruel, insane father-in-law had completely lost his mind and maliciously ruined their perfect lives. I had explicitly warned Kendall about Megan 5 years ago. I sat him down in my heavy leather office chair weeks before he proposed and told him the absolute truth. I told him that Megan did not love him as a man. I told him she was deeply in love with my corporate credit card, my exclusive country club memberships, and the massive trust fund she automatically assumed he possessed. Kendall had arrogantly dismissed my concerns, claiming I simply did not understand modern relationships and that I was permanently trapped in a bitter, outdated worldview. Now trapped in a pressurized metal tube 30,000 feet in the air without my money to artificially insulate him from reality, Kendall finally saw the true face of the woman he married. As Megan continued to loudly curse my name and demand Kendall fix the financial situation immediately, something inside my son finally snapped. He turned to his wife, his face flushed with extreme exhaustion and deep public embarrassment, and aggressively told her to shut her mouth. He hissed that she was making a pathetic public scene and that her constant shrill whining was giving him a severe migraine. It was the very first time I had ever seen Kendall stand up to her, and it instantly shattered their carefully constructed, superficial marital alliance. Megan gasped, her face twisting in pure shock, and she turned her body completely away from him, staring furiously out the small, scratched window into the pitch-black night for the remainder of the agonizing 8-hour flight. The impenetrable family unit they had confidently formed to legally execute me was already rotting from the inside out under the crushing, immediate weight of sudden poverty. The plane landed at O'Hare International Airport just as the cold gray dawn was breaking over the Chicago skyline. The biting Midwestern wind was a harsh welcome compared to the warm tropical breezes they had left behind. They dragged themselves off the aircraft physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and heavily wrinkled. There was no premium black car service waiting for them at the VIP curb. There was no personal chauffeur holding a printed digital sign with their family name. They followed the massive crowds of tired travelers down to the loud, chaotic ride-share pickup zone. Kendall, his phone battery practically dead, and his bank account still completely frozen by the federal government, was forced to beg Ethan to use the last remaining funds on a high-interest prepaid debit card to order a standard compact vehicle. The 5 of them squeezed uncomfortably into the back of a small, heavily scented sedan, their knees pressed tightly against their chests, their remaining designer luggage crammed violently into the tiny trunk. The drive through the heavy morning rush hour traffic was completely silent. The initial blinding shock of the Hawaiian financial disaster had worn off entirely, replaced by a deep, terrifying anxiety about what awaited them at the corporate office on Monday morning. Yet despite the massive financial devastation they had just endured, they still clung desperately to one final massive delusion. They genuinely believed they still had a safe, impenetrable sanctuary waiting for them at the end of the highway. They believed they could simply retreat to the 10,000-square-foot family estate, lock the heavy mahogany doors, take long hot showers in their custom marble bathrooms, and figure out a legal strategy to force me to reverse the corporate actions. They assumed the sprawling colonial mansion was their ultimate, untouchable fortress. The rideshare vehicle finally turned off the busy main road and slowly approached the towering wrought iron security gates of our exclusive suburban neighborhood. Cynthia sat up straighter in the cramped back seat, smoothing her wrinkled designer shirt, desperately trying to reclaim her shattered identity as the wealthy lady of the manor. The car pulled up to the digital keypad pedestal. Kendall rolled down the window, shivering slightly in the crisp morning air, and confidently punched in his private, highly customized 6-digit access code. The small screen flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. Kendall frowned, assuming he had simply mistyped the numbers in his exhausted state. He carefully entered the code a second time, pressing each button deliberately. The screen flashed red again. An automated error buzzer echoed loudly in the quiet morning air. The rideshare driver sighed heavily, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, eager to drop them off and collect his fare. Cynthia clicked her tongue in sheer irritation, leaning forward from the back seat to aggressively punch in her own master administrative code. The system immediately rejected her input. Jasmine tried her code. Ethan tried his. Every single digital combination they entered was completely invalid. The heavy iron gates remained firmly locked, entirely blocking their entry into the wealthy neighborhood. They were sitting in a cheap rental car on the cold curb of their own perceived kingdom, staring at a red digital light that definitively proved their absolute eviction from my life. The security firm I hired provided a full high-definition body camera recording of the entire encounter at the main gate, allowing me to watch the exact moment their arrogant delusion was completely shattered. The rideshare driver tapped his steering wheel, visibly annoyed by the blaring error buzzer of the digital keypad. Cynthia shoved the car door open, her high heels clicking aggressively against the cold suburban pavement. She marched right up to the heavy wrought iron gate, fully preparing to unleash decades of entitled fury upon the neighborhood security staff. She expected to see old Henry, the timid night watchman she regularly threatened to have fired whenever he took too long to open the gates for her wealthy friends. Instead, the small reinforced pedestrian door adjacent to the main driveway clicked open. Two massive men stepped out into the crisp morning air. They were not wearing the standard friendly neighborhood security polos. They were dressed in full black tactical gear, wearing heavy utility vests and carrying non-lethal deterrents. They were elite private corporate contractors hired directly by Jonathan Pierce to secure his newly purchased multi-million-dollar investment. Cynthia did not back down. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the lead contractor and screamed that she was the absolute lady of the house. She demanded they manually override the system immediately and let her family inside to rest. The lead contractor did not flinch. He did not apologize for the inconvenience. He calmly pulled a heavy clipboard from his tactical vest and asked her to explicitly confirm her legal identity. When she aggressively shouted her name, he nodded once, detached a thick, officially stamped legal document from his clipboard, and extended his hand through the iron bars. He informed her in a flat, unyielding voice that the property located at this exact address had been legally sold in a private all-cash corporate transaction. He stated that the new owners, an international private equity firm, had taken absolute physical possession of the estate at exactly noon the previous day. He advised her that her electronic access codes had been permanently deactivated and that she was currently trespassing on strictly private property. Cynthia snatched the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the bold legal print. She saw the official county seals, the municipal transfer stamps, and the undeniable signature of the corporate holding company I entirely controlled. The warm tropical tan completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and suddenly very old. The 10,000-square-foot colonial mansion, the grand ballroom, the custom Italian marble floors, and the meticulously manicured English gardens were officially gone. She stammered, her voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant power. She demanded to know what had happened to the interior contents of the house. She screamed about her imported designer clothes, her highly expensive jewelry, and her custom furniture, genuinely terrified that the new owners had thrown her precious belongings into a landfill. The contractor remained completely stoic. He reached into his tactical vest a second time and produced a plain, unmarked manila envelope. He slid it carefully through the iron bars. He stated that the previous owner had instructed his team to provide her with this specific envelope regarding the relocation of her personal effects. Before Cynthia could ask another frantic question, the contractor stepped back, locked the heavy pedestrian door, and pulled a two-way radio from his belt. He pointed directly at the rideshare vehicle and loudly ordered the driver to reverse the car off the private driveway, immediately warning that local police were already on standby for an active trespassing violation. The driver, terrified of losing his commercial license, slammed the car into reverse. Cynthia barely managed to jump back into the cramped back seat before the vehicle sped away from the imposing gates. Inside the moving car, Cynthia frantically tore open the manila envelope. She did not find a thick cashier's check or a key to a new luxury condominium. She found a single cheap brass key attached to a numbered plastic tag and a printed digital map. Kendall leaned over her shoulder to read the printed address. The location was not in their exclusive tree-lined suburb. It was located deep within a run-down, heavily industrialized sector on the far south side of Chicago. Ethan pulled out the last remaining crumpled $100 bill they had acquired from the Hawaiian pawn shop and begged the rideshare driver to take them directly to the new address. The long drive across the city was a brutal visual descent from their former manufactured glory. The sprawling green lawns, luxury boutiques, and pristine country clubs slowly gave way to rusted chain-link fences, abandoned manufacturing factories, and noisy commercial train yards. The rideshare car finally pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of a dilapidated, massive commercial storage facility. There were no private security patrols, no climate-controlled corridors, and no paved walkways to protect her expensive shoes. The freezing air smelled strongly of diesel fumes, damp concrete, and rotting garbage from a nearby dumpster. They dragged their heavy remaining luggage out of the trunk, the brass wheels catching violently on the broken pavement. They walked down a long, dark row of towering corrugated metal doors until they finally reached unit number 404. Cynthia gripped the cheap brass key, her hands trembling violently. She was entirely desperate to open the door fully, intending to retrieve her expensive winter furs and designer handbags to sell for immediate survival cash. She slid the brass key into the primary doorknob and turned it. The internal mechanism clicked open. She grabbed the heavy metal handle at the bottom of the corrugated door and pulled upward with all her remaining physical strength. The massive metal door did not budge a single inch. Cynthia pulled again, letting out a frustrated, exhausted cry that echoed through the empty industrial lot. Kendall stepped forward to help his mother, but he immediately saw the real problem. While the primary doorknob was officially unlocked, a massive, heavy-duty industrial padlock was bolted directly through a secondary steel latch welded to the absolute center of the door. The cheap brass key in Cynthia's hand was completely useless against it. Taped securely to the cold metal directly above the heavy padlock was a laminated legal notice printed on the thick, expensive letterhead of Robert Klein's corporate law firm. Kendall ripped the notice off the door and read the crisp black text aloud. His voice began to shake uncontrollably as the reality of my final trap closed tightly around his throat. The legal notice formally stated that the massive storage unit contained the abandoned personal property luxury vehicles and high-end effects of the Hayes family, meticulously packed and relocated by a professional extraction team. However, the document explicitly detailed that a highly restrictive financial lien had been legally placed against the entirety of the physical contents inside the vault. The formal notice concluded with one absolute non-negotiable condition. The secondary padlock would only be removed and their personal property would only be legally released back to them the exact moment Kendall Hayes fully repaid the $250,000 he had fraudulently attempted to wire to his offshore Cayman Islands shell account from my corporate reserve. The trap was beautifully, ruthlessly complete. Kendall had selfishly tried to steal a massive fortune from my logistics company to secure his own private wealth, leaving the rest of his family entirely exposed to my wrath. He thought he was being an untouchable corporate mastermind. Now, because of his arrogant, greedy action, the entire family was completely locked out of their only remaining physical possessions. Cynthia could not access her clothes, Jasmine could not access her jewelry, and Kendall could not access his luxury sports cars. The crushing, suffocating weight of their collective poverty fell squarely onto his tailored shoulders. Megan slowly turned her head to look at her husband, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. Jasmine began to scream at her brother, demanding he produce the money immediately. The fragile, superficial alliance of my betrayers had finally reached its ultimate breaking point in the middle of a freezing, filthy parking lot. They had absolutely nowhere left to go, which meant I knew exactly where they would head next. They were going to come looking for me. The freezing wind of the industrial park bit sharply through their thin, brightly colored designer resort wear. The crushing reality of the locked storage unit did not break Cynthia into immediate submission. Instead, it ignited a desperate, vicious rage deep inside her chest. She absolutely refused to accept that her reign over my wealth was permanently over. She genuinely believed that if she could just get into the same physical room as me, she could aggressively break me down. She had spent 35 years using her incredibly sharp tongue and relentless emotional manipulation to bend me to her specific will. She foolishly assumed my current physical weakness from the massive myocardial infarction would make me an easy, defenseless target. Since Ethan had completely drained his high-interest prepaid card on the rideshare vehicle, the family was forced to endure the ultimate social indignity. They dragged their heavy, brass-wheeled designer suitcases for 6 exhausting blocks through the broken, trash-littered industrial streets to reach a public transit stop. The wealthy lady of the manor and her spoiled, highly entitled children rode a crowded, noisy city bus all the way back to the downtown medical district. They were shivering violently, physically exhausted, and fueled entirely by pure, unadulterated venom. They stormed through the automatic sliding glass doors of the massive hospital lobby like a pack of cornered, starving wolves. They did not stop at the visitor registration desk to ask for permission. They marched directly to the primary elevator banks, aggressively punching the button for the cardiac intensive care floor. Cynthia was actively preparing her opening verbal attack in her mind, fully ready to scream, threaten, and physically intimidate me into signing a total legally binding reversal of the corporate merger and the real estate sale. They pushed forcefully through the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit, completely ignoring the large, brightly colored signs demanding absolute quiet in the medical corridor. Cynthia led the furious charge, her designer heels striking the polished linoleum floor with an aggressive, highly disruptive purpose. She marched straight toward the private corner recovery room where she had coldly abandoned me 6 days prior. She grabbed the heavy metal door handle and shoved it open, fully prepared to unleash absolute hell upon a dying, bedridden man. She stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hands still gripping the handle. The hospital room was completely silent. The heavy cardiac monitors were powered down and pushed against the far wall. The intravenous fluid poles were entirely empty. The mechanical hospital bed was perfectly made with crisp, tightly tucked, sterile white sheets. There was absolutely no trace of my existence in the room. Cynthia stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth hanging open in sheer profound disbelief. I had accurately anticipated this exact physical ambush the very moment I digitally severed their corporate credit lines. I knew that once the digital and financial walls closed in on them, they would instinctively seek a direct physical confrontation. I did not wait around in a vulnerable hospital bed to be their emotional punching bag. Exactly 3 days ago, while they were happily snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters of Maui and drinking expensive champagne, Robert Klein executed a highly coordinated, completely silent medical extraction. I was quietly discharged through a secure underground loading dock to avoid any public attention. I was carefully loaded into a private, heavily armored medical transport vehicle. I was safely relocated to an elite, highly undisclosed rehabilitation sanctuary located deep in a heavily forested neighboring county. As my family stared blankly at the empty hospital bed, I was currently sitting in a plush leather recliner overlooking a private, tranquil lake. I was surrounded by a dedicated team of elite physical therapists, personal chefs, and 2 armed off-duty police officers permanently stationed at my private door. I was completely untouchable. Kendall violently pushed past his mother, frantically searching the small bathroom attached to the hospital room as if I were somehow hiding from him in the narrow shower stall. Jasmine stormed back out into the hallway and aggressively demanded answers from a passing medical technician. The young nurse, holding a heavy stack of medical charts, stopped and looked at the disheveled, intensely angry family with a complicated mixture of confusion and profound irritation. Cynthia quickly recovered her arrogant, demanding posture. She puffed out her chest loudly, declaring to the entire corridor that she was the legal wife of the patient and demanding to know exactly which recovery floor I had been secretly moved to. The young nurse tapped her electronic identification badge against the secure computer terminal mounted on the wall and pulled up my digital medical file. The nurse's facial expression instantly shifted from polite confusion to cold, bureaucratic steel. She looked directly into Cynthia's eyes and plainly stated that Mr. Hayes had been officially and permanently discharged from the medical facility. Cynthia completely exploded. She slammed her hands violently against the nurse's station counter, screaming that the hospital was lying to her and that a man recovering from a massive heart attack could not simply walk out the front door without his family knowing. She aggressively played the devoted, terrified wife card, demanding the immediate release of my confidential forwarding address and my current physical status. The senior charge nurse, a seasoned medical veteran who tolerated absolutely zero nonsense on her critical care floor, immediately stepped out from a back office. She informed Cynthia that according to the newly executed Advanced Healthcare Directive and the superseding medical power of attorney actively on file, Cynthia had been entirely stripped of all medical proxy rights. The charge nurse stated with absolute clarity that Robert Klein, my corporate attorney, was the sole authorized individual legally permitted to access my medical location, authorize treatments, or even confirm if I was still alive. She then firmly instructed the hysterical family to lower their voices immediately, warning them that she would gladly summon hospital security to forcefully remove them and press charges for disrupting a critical care environment. Cynthia tried to loudly argue falsely, claiming her marital rights automatically superseded any lawyer's document, but the charge nurse simply picked up the telephone and dialed the main security desk. Kendall, suddenly realizing they were completely defeated and seconds away from being arrested for trespassing, grabbed his mother's arm and physically dragged her toward the elevators. The impenetrable physical distance I had strategically established was the final devastating nail in the coffin of their immediate retaliation. They were forced to ride the elevator back down to the ground floor in absolute suffocating silence. The heavy elevator doors slid open, depositing the exhausted, thoroughly broken family into the massive, echoing main lobby of the hospital. They were completely out of options. They had no luxury home to return to, no money to buy basic food, no vehicles to drive, and absolutely no way to contact me to beg for financial mercy. Megan sat heavily down on her expensive designer suitcase right in the middle of the crowded lobby, burying her face in her hands and weeping loudly. Ethan stood awkwardly beside her, staring blankly at the automatic glass exit doors, finally realizing his lifetime meal ticket was permanently gone. Cynthia paced frantically back and forth across the polished floor, muttering under her breath about calling local media outlets to expose my supposed cruelty. Kendall and Jasmine stood near the hospital pharmacy, quietly arguing about which cheap, heavily advertised local attorney they could possibly hire on contingency to fight the massive corporate merger. They were so entirely consumed by their own spectacular downfall that they never even noticed the two men watching them from the crowded seating area. The two men were dressed in unremarkable, incredibly cheap gray suits. They did not look like standard hospital security guards, and they certainly did not possess the casual demeanor of local police officers. They possessed the distinct, rigid, unyielding posture of federal government employees. As Kendall finally turned away from his sister to walk toward the exit, the two men stepped directly into his path, effectively blocking his escape route to the street. The taller of the two men reached into his breast pocket and produced a solid brass badge enclosed in a black leather wallet. He introduced himself in a flat, emotionless voice as a special agent with the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. He looked completely past Kendall and locked his cold eyes directly onto Jasmine. The federal agent stated loudly and clearly that an automatic federal flag had been generated within their systems regarding an $85,000 personal loan issued to them by a recently dissolved corporate logistics entity. He explained that because the massive funds were explicitly utilized for personal luxury travel and had not been formally declared as taxable personal income on any preliminary corporate filings, the federal system had instantly triggered a severe mandatory audit of their finances. Kendall tried to stutter out a pathetic defense, claiming it was just a simple accounting error made by the corporate finance department. The agent did not even blink. He calmly informed my completely terrified children that the audit was no longer a simple tax discrepancy. Because the funds were pulled directly from corporate operational reserves without proper board authorization or legitimate business purpose. The Internal Revenue Service was officially opening a joint federal investigation into massive corporate embezzlement and severe tax evasion. The financial trap I had meticulously set from my hospital bed had finally snapped entirely shut, catching them right in the middle of a highly public lobby. The intense interrogation by the federal tax agents in the hospital lobby should have been the ultimate breaking point for my family. It should have sent them running to the nearest public defender to beg for a plea deal. Instead, Cynthia relied on the only survival mechanism she had ever known. She leaned heavily into her blinding, irrational arrogance. She gathered her terrified children and their utterly useless spouses, marched them out of the hospital, and used their last few dollars to ride the public transit system straight into the heart of the downtown financial district. She was determined to storm the luxurious corporate offices of my primary attorney, Robert Klein. She genuinely believed that if she screamed loud enough, threatened public scandal, and aggressively demanded her 50% share of the marital estate, the entire legal system would instantly bow to her will. She was operating under the deeply flawed assumption that our 35 years of marriage automatically guaranteed her half of my massive logistics empire, regardless of her personal actions. I knew exactly when they arrived at the law firm because I was sitting comfortably in my private rehabilitation sanctuary, sipping hot black tea and listening to a live encrypted audio feed transmitted directly from the hidden microphone on Robert's massive mahogany desk. Cynthia burst through the heavy glass doors of Robert's corner office without waiting for the administrative assistant to announce her arrival. The sheer visual contrast must have been incredibly striking. Robert sat behind his desk wearing a pristine, custom-tailored Italian suit projecting absolute calm and terrifying legal authority. Cynthia Kendall, Jasmine. Megan and Ethan stood before him looking like exhausted, disheveled refugees. They were still wearing the exact same brightly colored, heavily wrinkled tropical resort wear they had worn on the grueling economy flight from Maui. Their designer accessories were gone, pawned away for basic survival cash. Cynthia slammed her bare hands down on the polished wood of Robert's desk. She completely bypassed standard legal greetings and launched immediately into a venomous, highly rehearsed tirade. She loudly declared that I had entirely lost my mind due to the cardiac trauma and that she was initiating an immediate, highly publicized divorce proceeding. She aggressively demanded a comprehensive list of all current marital assets, full access to the frozen primary bank accounts, and an emergency judicial injunction to reverse the sale of the suburban mansion. She cited her 3 decades of supposed loyalty, claiming she had built the logistics empire right alongside me and was legally entitled to exactly half of every single penny I possessed under the state laws of Illinois. Robert did not interrupt her. He did not raise his voice or attempt to argue with her incredibly flawed logic. He simply let her scream until her voice grew raspy and she physically ran out of breath. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his porcelain coffee cup, allowing the heavy silence in the room to stretch until it became suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely devoid of emotion, operating with the cold, surgical precision of a seasoned corporate executioner. He smoothly agreed with Cynthia that the state of Illinois generally operates under the principle of equitable distribution during a standard divorce. He acknowledged that in a normal, highly amicable separation, a long-term spouse might reasonably expect a roughly equal division of the shared marital wealth. Then Robert reached down into his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a massive 4-inch thick black binder. He dropped it squarely onto the center of the polished desk. The heavy thud echoed loudly through my secure audio feed. Robert looked directly into Cynthia's highly dilated eyes and informed her that this was absolutely not a normal divorce. He calmly explained the specific, devastating legal concept of the dissipation of marital assets. Under state law, if one spouse actively and maliciously attempts to destroy, hide, or significantly devalue the shared marital estate for their own personal selfish gain, they completely forfeit their fundamental right to an equitable split. A judge will actively penalize the offending spouse, stripping them of their unearned wealth to fully compensate the victimized party. Cynthia scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively. She arrogantly demanded to know how she could possibly be accused of destroying assets when I was the one who had secretly sold their primary residence and merged the logistics company overnight. Robert opened the massive black binder to the very first page. He did not present a complex financial spreadsheet or a vague legal theory. He presented a high-resolution, digitally authenticated scan of the exact contract the extraction team had pulled from the hidden biometric floor safe in her master bedroom closet. He slid the crisp page across the desk. Cynthia looked down at the paper, and the remaining color instantly drained from her exhausted face. Robert read the core clauses of the contract aloud for the entire room to hear. He detailed her secret, highly documented meetings with the chief executive officer of my largest corporate rival. He explicitly read the clause where she formally promised to leverage a fraudulent medical conservatorship over my incapacitated body to forcefully sell my logistics empire for a fraction of its true market value. He read the exact 8-figure cash payout she had secretly negotiated for herself as a malicious kickback for destroying my life's work. Robert stated with absolute terrifying clarity that this hidden contract proved extreme premeditated bad faith. She had actively conspired with a hostile corporate entity to intentionally obliterate hundreds of millions of dollars in shared marital wealth. Robert informed her that he had already submitted the fully authenticated document to the primary probate judge and the Federal Regulatory Commission. Because her documented actions constituted a severe malicious breach of fiduciary duty to the marital estate, her legal claim to a 50% split was entirely nullified. She was not walking away with half of my empire. She was walking away with absolutely nothing but the wrinkled clothes on her back and the massive legal bills she would incur trying to defend herself against the impending corporate espionage charges. Cynthia collapsed backward into a leather guest chair, her mouth opening and closing silently, utterly paralyzed by the flawless execution of the legal trap. Kendall and Jasmine stood frozen near the office door, completely suffocated by the sheer magnitude of their mother's exposed treachery. They were already facing a massive federal audit for their own corporate embezzlement, and now they realized their primary financial safety net was completely obliterated. But Robert was not finished dispensing my retaliation. He shifted his cold, analytical gaze away from my blood relatives and locked his eyes directly onto Megan and Ethan. My two highly entitled in-laws instinctively took a physical step backward, nervously bumping into the heavy oak door. They had spent the entire morning loudly complaining that they were innocent victims, unfairly dragged into a bitter family dispute by their spouses. They genuinely believed that because they were not my direct biological children and had not personally signed the forged power of attorney document, they were completely shielded from the explosive legal fallout. They were entirely wrong. Robert reached into his top desk drawer and pulled out 2 thick, heavily sealed manila envelopes. He stood up from his leather chair and walked around the desk, extending one envelope to Megan and the other directly to Ethan. He did not offer a polite explanation. He stated firmly that these were formal, heavily documented civil lawsuits filed personally by Martin Hayes in the federal district court. Ethan's hands shook violently as he tore open the seal and scanned the bold legal print on the first page. He was officially being sued for multi-million-dollar damages regarding severe cyber trespassing, digital espionage, and attempted financial fraud. Robert explicitly detailed the exact methodology of the trap. He explained that my encrypted private cloud servers had automatically logged every single aggressive digital intrusion Ethan had attempted from the luxury resort in Maui. The lawsuit contained his exact internet protocol address, the unique media access control signature of his imported laptop, and a minute-by-minute timestamp of his automated password cracking scripts. Ethan had actively attempted to hack into a highly secured digital vault to steal the master legal deeds to a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. This was not a minor familial misunderstanding. It was a severe violation of the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Because Ethan had launched the cyber attack using his personal devices while completely outside the scope of any legitimate corporate employment, I was not suing the dissolved logistics company. I was piercing the corporate veil entirely. I was suing Ethan and Megan personally, targeting whatever meager personal assets they possessed, threatening to completely bankrupt their individual futures. Megan let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping the thick legal document onto the floor as if it were physically burning her hands. She finally comprehended the absolute reality of her situation. She was married to an unemployed man facing federal embezzlement charges, and she was now personally named in a massive, ruinous cyber fraud lawsuit orchestrated by a billionaire with infinite legal resources. She looked frantically at Kendall, desperately searching his exhausted face for a magical solution, but Kendall simply stared at the floor, completely broken by the relentless onslaught of consequences. Ethan turned his panicked gaze toward Jasmine, silently begging his wife to intervene and protect him. The unified, arrogant family front that had confidently strutted into the hospital room less than a week ago to strip me of my rights was officially dead. The intense pressure of the legal slaughterhouse had successfully cracked their alliance wide open. The deep, vicious fractures were rapidly spreading, and the primal instinct for absolute self-preservation was finally overriding their toxic familial loyalty. They were trapped in a sinking ship, and they were entirely ready to throw each other into the freezing water just to survive another day. The heavy mahogany walls of Robert Klein's corner office perfectly contained the explosive, catastrophic destruction of my family. I listened to the high-definition audio feed streaming directly into my secure earpiece at the rehabilitation facility, entirely captivated by the sheer speed of their collapse. Megan was the very first to break. She stood completely rigid in the center of the luxurious room, staring blindly at the massive civil lawsuit resting on the floor near her expensive designer shoes. The terrifying reality of personal bankruptcy and federal cyber fraud charges completely shattered her superficial loyalty. She did not politely ask for a moment to consult a defense attorney. She did not look at Kendall for reassurance. She turned toward her husband with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Her voice echoed sharply through the quiet office, completely devoid of any marital affection. She screamed at Kendall, calling him a pathetic, incompetent failure who could not even manage to steal from his own dying father correctly. Megan unleashed years of suppressed resentment in a single vicious tirade. She loudly mocked his fake executive title, his total lack of business acumen, and his absolute inability to protect her from my wrath. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Cynthia, screaming that she absolutely refused to go down with this toxic sinking ship of a family. Megan bent down, snatched her expensive leather handbag from the chair, and aggressively shoved Kendall out of her way. She announced to the entire room that she was taking a taxi straight to her parents' estate in the wealthy northern suburbs. She promised Kendall that her father would immediately hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the city of Chicago to legally sever her from his criminal liability. She slammed the heavy office door behind her with enough force to rattle the framed legal degrees hanging on the wall. Kendall stood completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, entirely stripped of his wife and his dignity in less than 60 seconds. The heavy slam of his door acted as a starting pistol for the ultimate betrayal. Ethan had watched his sister-in-law successfully escape the immediate blast radius, and his own cowardly survival instincts violently kicked in. Ethan was a chronically failed software entrepreneur who had spent his entire adult life desperately avoiding hard work and personal responsibility. He looked down at his own thick envelope containing the multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit for cyber trespassing. He looked at his wife Jasmine, who was quietly sobbing into her hands. He then looked directly across the polished desk at Robert Klein. Ethan cleared his throat deliberately, stepping away from the rest of the family to visually and physically separate himself from their sinking alliance. Ethan asked Robert in a quiet, trembling voice if there was any possible avenue for a legal settlement. Jasmine violently snapped her head up, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute shock. She grabbed Ethan by the sleeve of his wrinkled resort shirt, demanding to know what he was doing. Ethan aggressively shook her hand off his arm. He looked his wife directly in the eyes and coldly stated that he absolutely refused to go to federal prison for her arrogant mother and her stupid brother. He turned his back on Jasmine entirely and made his formal offer to my attorney. Ethan offered to become a cooperating witness for the federal government and for my personal civil litigation team. He promised to provide fully sworn, notarized affidavits detailing the exact timeline of Cynthia's secret meetings with the rival logistics executives. He offered to surrender his encrypted laptop, promising it contained digital audio recordings of Kendall bragging about the offshore Cayman Islands accounts and the fraudulent wire transfers. Ethan was willing to completely sell out my wife and my son to the federal authorities in exchange for a binding conditional immunity agreement that would permanently drop the cyber fraud lawsuit against him. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical scream, throwing herself at Ethan and blindly pounding her fists against his chest. She called him a traitor, a coward, and a pathetic parasite. Ethan simply pushed her away, maintaining his desperate gaze on Robert. Robert leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute corporate calculation. He tapped a silver pen against his desk, letting the agonizing silence stretch. Robert slowly nodded. He informed Ethan that if his digital evidence proved to be entirely authentic and he fully cooperated with the federal tax investigators without committing perjury, my legal team would formally withdraw the civil lawsuit with prejudice. Ethan let out a massive, shuddering breath of profound relief. He did not say a single word of apology to his weeping wife. He did not even glance at Cynthia, who was staring at him with eyes full of pure, homicidal rage. Ethan simply turned on his heel and walked out of the law firm, leaving his shattered marriage and his ruined in-laws completely behind. The grand, arrogant family alliance that had confidently marched into my hospital room to steal my empire was officially dead, entirely consumed by their own selfish greed. Cynthia was finally left alone with her two broken, weeping children. The sprawling logistics empire she had plotted to steal was gone. The 10,000 square foot suburban mansion was sold. The luxury vehicles were locked behind an ironclad financial lien. Her daughter-in-law had fled, and her son-in-law had just formally defected to the enemy. She looked at Kendall, who was staring blankly at the wall, entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of a federal prison sentence. She looked at Jasmine, who was curled in a chair sobbing uncontrollably over her instantly destroyed marriage. Cynthia realized in that exact moment that her children were no longer useful assets. They were massive radioactive liabilities. She had absolutely no leverage, no hidden financial reserves, and no powerful allies left in the city of Chicago. Robert Klein stood up from his desk smoothly, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He checked his expensive wristwatch and politely informed the remaining members of the Hayes family that their unannounced meeting was officially over. He stated that he had legitimate paying corporate clients to attend to. He reached for his desk phone and pressed a single button summoning the building's security detail. 2 massive, heavily armed security guards entered the corner office seconds later. They firmly instructed Cynthia, Kendall, and Jasmine to walk toward the elevators. They were publicly marched through the busy, glass-walled corridors of the prestigious law firm like common criminals. They were escorted down to the ground floor lobby and pushed out through the revolving glass doors onto the freezing, crowded city pavement. Cynthia stood on the noisy street corner as the bitter Midwestern wind whipped against her thin resort clothing. She looked at her 2 ruined children shivering beside her. She knew they had absolutely no money for a taxi, no hotel reservations, and no friends who would dare cross my legal team to offer them shelter. The crushing, inescapable reality of total bankruptcy finally settled over her shoulders. She had lost the financial war, she had lost the legal battle, and she had lost the loyalty of her own family. However, Cynthia possessed a deeply toxic, venomous pride that absolutely refused to accept a silent defeat. If she could not win in a courtroom and she could not win in the boardroom, she decided to fight in the only arena she had left. She decided to completely destroy my reputation in the court of public opinion. Cynthia physically turned her back on Kendall and Jasmine, leaving them shivering helplessly on the street corner. She walked halfway down the busy block, finding a quiet alcove near a crowded coffee shop. She pulled her smartphone from her designer purse, her hands shaking with a fresh wave of adrenaline and pure malice. She scrolled rapidly through her extensive digital contact list until she found the private number of a local investigative television producer she had met at a high society charity gala the previous year. This specific journalist was notorious for airing highly sensationalized, deeply biased takedowns of wealthy Chicago businessmen. Cynthia pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear. When the producer answered, Cynthia completely transformed her voice. She forced heavy, dramatic tears into her eyes, fully adopting the pathetic persona of a terrified, abused wife. She spun a horrific, highly calculated lie right there on the sidewalk. She claimed that I was a deeply controlling, emotionally abusive tyrant who had suffered severe permanent brain damage during my recent heart attack. She tearfully stated that I had completely lost my mind, aggressively hijacked the family logistics company, and maliciously thrown my loving, devoted family out onto the freezing streets without a single dollar to our names. She pitched an exclusive primetime television interview to expose the dark, twisted reality behind my massive corporate merger. She promised to provide sensational, heartbreaking details of my supposed mental decay. She was entirely determined to paint me as a deranged, vicious monster, hoping the resulting public outrage would permanently destroy my legacy and force my corporate board to offer her a massive, quiet settlement just to make the embarrassing scandal disappear. Cynthia successfully pitched her highly sensationalized story of domestic victimhood while shivering on the freezing pavement of the financial district. She promised the ambitious television producer a massive, exclusive primetime scandal involving a wealthy logistics magnate who had suffered severe brain damage and maliciously thrown his completely innocent family onto the street. The producer, salivating over the prospect of a massive ratings boost during the competitive sweeps week, immediately dispatched a private car to pick Cynthia up. They brought her directly to the downtown broadcast studio, rushing her through the security checkpoints and straight into the hair and makeup department. I received the intelligence report regarding her media play less than an hour later. Robert Klein possessed an extensive network of highly placed legal contacts throughout the city, including a senior corporate attorney who worked directly for the broadcasting network's general counsel. The attorney quietly flagged Robert, warning him that the station was rapidly preparing a special investigative segment designed to entirely destroy my professional reputation. They were planning to broadcast Cynthia's completely fabricated narrative that my myocardial infarction had resulted in acute hypoxia, completely destroying my cognitive functions and turning me into a paranoid, abusive tyrant controlled by my lawyers. I sat in my plush leather recliner at the rehabilitation facility looking out over the quiet, tranquil lake. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. Cynthia was attempting to fight a modern digital war using vastly outdated emotional tactics. She genuinely believed that if she cried on high-definition television, the public would automatically blindly side with the grieving wife. She completely failed to realize that the most devastating weapon in any public relations war is unadulterated, highly documented reality. I did not instruct Robert to file a standard quiet cease and desist order. I instructed him to drop a tactical nuclear strike directly onto the network headquarters. Robert compiled a massive encrypted digital dossier and transmitted it directly to the personal email inbox of the network's chief legal officer. The digital package did not contain vague threats or emotional pleas. It contained absolute, undeniable proof of Cynthia's malicious perjury. Robert included the formally signed, heavily authenticated psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Mitchell definitively proving my cognitive functions were absolutely perfect, and my executive reasoning was completely intact. He included the forensic accounting logs showing Kendall explicitly attempting to wire $250,000 to an offshore shell corporation. He included the hostile takeover contract Cynthia had signed with my primary corporate rival. The crown jewel of the digital dossier was the raw, unedited audio recording from the intensive care unit. My private security team had successfully pulled the digitized medical dispatch recordings from the hospital archives. The audio file contained the exact moment the attending emergency room physician called Cynthia to inform her that her husband had suffered a massive heart attack. It perfectly captured her heavy, annoyed sigh. It captured her chilling, utterly devoid voice asking if I was stabilized strictly because she had a luxury flight to Maui in 12 hours and refused to cancel her vacation. Robert attached a single, terrifying legal cover letter to the evidence. He explicitly informed the network that if they broadcasted a single second of Cynthia's fabricated interview, my legal team would immediately file a $100 million defamation and libel lawsuit against the parent company, the executive producers, and the specific journalists involved. Inside the broadcast studio, Cynthia was sitting comfortably in the bright lights of the set. She had specifically instructed the makeup artist to leave her skin looking slightly pale and drawn, meticulously crafting the physical appearance of an exhausted, terrified victim. She practiced her fake tears in the monitor, ready to deliver the performance of a lifetime. The heavy studio doors suddenly burst open. The lead investigative producer did not walk onto the set with a clipboard and a supportive smile. She stormed across the floor, accompanied by two highly agitated corporate lawyers wearing sharp suits. The producer was entirely furious, her face flushed with extreme anger. She did not ask Cynthia if she was ready for the interview. She aggressively shoved a digital tablet directly into Cynthia's face and hit the playback button. Cynthia's own cold, venomous voice echoed loudly through the silent television studio, complaining about her Hawaiian vacation itinerary while her husband was dying. The producer screamed at Cynthia, calling her a massive, manipulative liability. The network lawyers had reviewed the explosive dossier provided by Robert Klein and immediately pulled the plug on the entire segment. They realized Cynthia had intentionally lied to them in an attempt to weaponize their broadcast network for her own fraudulent financial gain. The lawyers ordered the studio security team to physically remove her from the premises. Cynthia was unceremoniously yanked out of the comfortable makeup chair, dragged through the busy corporate lobby, and thrown out the back service doors into the cold alleyway. She was banned permanently from the building. Stopping the television interview was only the defensive phase of my strategy. I was fully committed to ensuring she could never attempt to manipulate the public narrative again. I authorized my private security firm to anonymously release the exact same digital dossier directly to the internet. They did not just dump the files blindly. They strategically seeded the hospital audio recording and Kendall's fraudulent wire transfer receipts across massive local community message boards, prominent social media platforms, and highly trafficked logistics industry forums. The internet absolutely loves a spectacular villain, and my family provided the perfect target. The digital explosion was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The audio recording of Cynthia prioritizing her Hawaiian vacation over my life went massively viral within a matter of hours. The chilling phrase regarding her flight to Maui became a trending topic across the city of Chicago, widely mocked and fiercely condemned by millions of strangers. People were genuinely horrified by the sheer sociopathic cruelty in her voice. Independent online investigators quickly cross-referenced the leaked audio with Kendall's corporate theft documents. Within 24 hours, my family's faces, their full names, and their specific corporate crimes were plastered across every single corner of the digital landscape. The immediate real-world consequences of their sudden viral infamy were absolutely catastrophic. The temporary superficial alliance they had fractured in Robert's office completely disintegrated as they became complete social pariahs. Cynthia attempted to call her wealthy, influential friends from the country club, desperately hoping to secure a temporary loan or a place to sleep. Every single call went directly to voicemail. Her society friends had heard the viral audio and wanted absolutely nothing to do with a woman who possessed such a profound lack of basic human empathy. She was officially blacklisted from every exclusive social circle she had spent 3 decades meticulously cultivating. Kendall and Jasmine faced an entirely different kind of absolute destruction. With their bank accounts completely frozen by the federal tax audit and their luxury assets locked away in a storage unit they could not access, they desperately needed immediate income just to buy food and secure basic shelter. Kendall attempted to leverage his expensive Ivy League business degree, aggressively sending his resume to various mid-level logistics and corporate management firms across the state. He did not secure a single interview. Every corporate hiring manager actively ran a basic background check. A simple internet search immediately produced the highly detailed viral evidence of his attempted $250,000 corporate embezzlement. He was completely radioactive in the professional business world. Jasmine experienced the exact same brutal rejection in the marketing sector. Their severe financial desperation quickly forced them to completely abandon their extreme arrogance. They realized they could not secure corporate employment, so they actively applied for basic entry-level minimum wage positions. Kendall walked into a local busy fast food restaurant located in a rundown neighborhood, completely swallowing his immense pride to ask the teenage shift manager for a job application. The young manager looked closely at Kendall's exhausted, heavily lined face, instantly recognizing him from the viral videos circulating on his smartphone. The teenager laughed directly in Kendall's face, loudly calling him the Maui thief in front of a lobby full of customers. The manager explicitly refused to give him an application and told him to leave the restaurant immediately. They were trapped in a truly inescapable nightmare of their own creation. They were entirely stripped of my protective wealth, actively hunted by federal tax agents, embroiled in massive civil lawsuits, and universally despised by the general public. They could not leverage their past connections, they could not secure new employment, and they could not hide from their viral infamy. They were forced to sleep in the cheapest, most dangerous hourly motels they could find on the outskirts of the city, pooling the last few coins they had just to split a single fast food meal. The absolute crushing weight of severe poverty and public humiliation systematically broke down every single defense mechanism they possessed. I monitored their rapid descent through the detailed reports provided by my private investigators, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute closure. I knew they had reached the absolute bottom of the barrel. I knew the final, inevitable chapter of their destruction was rapidly approaching. They had completely run out of options, which meant there was only one thing left for Cynthia to do. She was going to have to swallow her toxic pride and come crawling directly to me. 6 months passed since the absolute destruction of their superficial empire. The brutal Midwestern winter eventually thawed, taking the last remaining shreds of their public dignity with it. I did not stay in Chicago to watch the final pathetic chapters of their downfall. The massive corporate merger was fully integrated, the federal investigations were entirely out of my hands, and my highly publicized divorce from Cynthia was aggressively finalized in record time. Because she possessed absolutely zero financial resources to hire a competent defense attorney, and because Robert Klein presented the judge with the undeniable authenticated proof of her corporate sabotage, the presiding magistrate granted a completely unbalanced divorce decree. She was awarded absolutely nothing from my estate. The logistics company, the liquidated real estate assets, and my private investment portfolios were securely locked behind impenetrable legal trusts. I was finally completely free. I relocated thousands of miles away from the toxic, suffocating noise of the city. I purchased a beautiful, modest ranch house nestled deep within a sprawling valley in Montana. The property was surrounded by towering snow-capped mountains and endless acres of pristine, untouched pine forests. There were no imported Italian marble floors, no grand ballrooms to host superficial charity galas, and no massive wrought iron security gates. The house was built of solid weathered timber and local stone. It was incredibly quiet, incredibly peaceful, and absolutely mine. The crisp, clean mountain air did wonders for my physical recovery. I spent my mornings hiking the rugged trails behind my property, feeling my chest expand and my newly repaired heart pump strong, steady blood through my veins. At 69 years old, I was in the best physical shape I had been in since my 30s. I traded my expensive tailored corporate suits for heavy denim thick flannel shirts and sturdy leather work boots. I looked sharp, healthy, and profoundly rested. It was a brisk Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting comfortably on the wide wrap-around wooden porch of my ranch holding a steaming mug of black coffee and watching the wind rustle through the tall grass. I heard the distinct, unnatural crunch of gravel echoing down my long, unpaved driveway long before I actually saw the vehicle. A small, incredibly cheap rented sedan slowly crept up the winding dirt road. The car was coated in a thick layer of pale gray dust, its engine whining in harsh protest against the steep mountain incline. The vehicle finally pulled to a stop near the base of my porch steps. The driver's side door opened with a loud, metallic creak. Cynthia stepped out into the bright Montana sunlight. The sheer physical transformation was absolutely staggering. The wealthy, arrogant lady of the manor who had marched into my hospital room demanding my signature was completely gone. She looked significantly aged, completely hollowed out by the crushing weight of severe poverty and intense public humiliation. She was wearing a cheap synthetic winter coat that did not fit her properly. Her hair, which she used to spend thousands of dollars maintaining at exclusive downtown salons every single month, was now dull, brittle, and heavily streaked with stark, untended gray. Her face was deeply lined with profound exhaustion. The heavy, expertly applied makeup she used to wear like a protective mask was entirely absent, revealing the dark, bruised bags under her eyes. She looked small, defeated, and utterly broken. She stood frozen near the dusty hood of the rental car, nervously clutching a worn, imitation leather purse tightly against her chest. She stared up at me sitting on the porch, her eyes darting frantically around the modest ranch, desperately trying to reconcile the powerful billionaire corporate titan she had married with the rugged, calm man drinking coffee in a flannel shirt. I did not stand up to greet her. I did not offer her a chair or ask her if she was thirsty from her incredibly long journey. I simply took another slow sip of my hot coffee and watched her with absolute detached clinical interest. I let the heavy, suffocating silence of the vast mountain landscape press down entirely upon her shoulders. Cynthia slowly walked toward the wooden steps, her cheap shoes scuffing loudly against the dirt. The moment her foot touched the first wooden stair, her carefully rehearsed facade completely crumbled. She broke down into heavy, ragged sobs. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the hard wooden planks of my porch, burying her face in her hands. The tears were genuine this time, entirely unlike the fake performance she had attempted to give the television producer 6 months ago. However, I knew with absolute certainty that she was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for betraying me. She was crying because her feet hurt, because she was freezing in a cheap coat, and because she was completely terrified of her bleak, impoverished future. She looked up at me, her face slick with tears, and her voice trembling violently. She launched directly into a desperate, frantic apology. She claimed she had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. She aggressively blamed the sheer panic of my sudden heart attack, falsely claiming the medical crisis had severely clouded her judgment and made her susceptible to bad advice from ruthless corporate executives. She repeatedly invoked the sacred duration of our marriage, begging me to remember the 35 years we had spent together. She desperately tried to remind me of the early days when we lived in a tiny apartment and I worked 80-hour weeks driving freight trucks. She weaponized our shared history, attempting to use the ghost of our past to extract financial mercy from me in the present. I listened to her entire performance in absolute, unbroken silence. I did not nod in agreement, and I did not shake my head in disgust. I simply let her empty every single manipulative tactic out of her depleted arsenal. When she realized the tears and the heavy nostalgia were having absolutely zero visible effect on my demeanor, she finally transitioned to the true pathetic purpose of her cross-country journey. The weeping slowly subsided, replaced by a raw, naked, desperate plea for basic survival. Cynthia confessed the brutal reality of her current existence. With Kendall and Jasmine facing imminent federal indictment and massive legal bills, they had completely abandoned her to save themselves. She was entirely alone. She told me she was currently living in a cramped, filthy studio apartment located directly above a noisy commercial laundromat on the extreme south side of Chicago. She had to ride 2 different city buses just to buy cheap groceries. She had absolutely no marketable skills, no retirement savings, and no friends who would acknowledge her existence. She looked at my sturdy ranch, my healthy posture, and the clear peace in my eyes, and she finally begged for a handout. She did not ask for her millions back. She did not ask to move into the ranch with me. She humbled herself completely, begging for just a tiny, insignificant fraction of my massive wealth. She asked for a small basic monthly stipend, just enough money to move out of the dangerous neighborhood and buy decent food. She swore on her actual life that if I granted her this one small financial mercy, she would disappear forever and never contact me again. She finished her pathetic plea and kneeled on the wooden boards, staring up at me with wide, desperate eyes, eagerly waiting for me to pull out a checkbook and permanently end her suffering. I carefully placed my ceramic coffee mug down on the small wooden table beside my recliner. I stood up slowly, towering over her kneeling form. The cold mountain wind swept across the porch, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles. I reached my right hand inside the breast pocket of my heavy flannel shirt. I did not pull out a silver pen or a leather checkbook. I pulled out a single neatly folded piece of crisp white paper. I looked down at her, my face a mask of absolute unforgiving granite. I unfolded the paper and held it out toward her trembling hands. Cynthia eagerly snatched the document, genuinely believing I was handing her a legal settlement or a bank draft. She looked down at the paper, her eyes scanning the printed text. It was not a check. It was a massive, highly detailed, itemized invoice. It was the original official hospital bill from the exact night I suffered my massive myocardial infarction. It detailed the emergency room stabilizers, the intensive care unit bed, the complex cardiac monitoring, and the life-saving interventions the medical team had performed while she was heavily complaining about her Hawaiian vacation itinerary. I looked directly into her terrified, hollow eyes. My voice was incredibly low, perfectly steady and colder than the Midwestern winter she had just survived. I told her that she had deliberately left me to pay that exact price entirely alone while I was actively bleeding out on a hospital bed. I stated that she had chosen a private beach cabana over my actual heartbeat. I explicitly informed her that my financial obligations to her completely expired the exact second she hung up the phone on the emergency room doctor. I told her to carefully save her pathetic tears for the federal prosecutors. I delivered my final absolute verdict. I told her to pay for her own miserable life. I did not wait to see the final crushing realization wash over her face. I did not stay to listen to her scream or beg or curse my name. I simply turned my back on her kneeling form. I walked steadily across the wide porch, opened the heavy, solid oak front door of my home, stepped inside the warm, quiet entryway, and pulled the door shut behind me. The heavy brass deadbolt engaged with a loud, incredibly satisfying, and totally permanent click. I left her completely stranded on a cold wooden porch in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles away from the city she used to rule, with absolutely nothing but a piece of paper reminding her exactly why she was going to die poor. The heavy click of my brass deadbolt echoing across the porch was the final punctuation mark on my marriage. I did not watch Cynthia drive her dusty rental car back down the steep mountain road. I simply returned to my quiet living room, poured a fresh cup of hot coffee, and permanently erased her from my mind. The absolute silence of the Montana Valley was a stark, beautiful contrast to the deafening reality my family was currently enduring back in the unforgiving concrete landscape of Chicago. The severe financial vacuum I created had forced them into the brutal grinding machinery of the working class they had spent their entire lives violently mocking. Kendall, my arrogant son, who once wore tailored Italian suits and casually wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to offshore shell accounts, was finally introduced to the concept of actual punishing physical labor. With his professional reputation completely obliterated by the viral internet leaks, no corporate entity in the entire Midwest would even allow him past the security desk in their lobby. He was entirely desperate to pay the massive legal retainers required to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. He had to take the absolute only job that did not require a rigorous corporate background check. Kendall took a job working the grueling overnight shift as a heavy commercial freight loader. The sheer punishing irony of his employment was a masterpiece of cosmic justice I could not have orchestrated better myself if I had actively tried. He was not just working at any random industrial facility, he was physically loading heavy shipping crates at a massive regional distribution warehouse entirely owned and operated by Apex International. He was literally breaking his back sweating under harsh fluorescent lights for a meager hourly wage, working the lowest possible tier for the exact global conglomerate that had legally absorbed my life's work. Every single night he had to clock in and wear a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform, bearing the company logo he once thought he was entirely too important to manage. He had to physically load the exact same commercial diesel trucks he used to legally own. His hands, previously manicured and incredibly soft, were now heavily calloused, blistered and permanently stained with industrial grease. He was forced to take direct orders from shift supervisors who were 20 years younger than him, men who possessed absolutely zero patience for his lingering entitlement. If he arrived 2 minutes late to the loading dock, his pay was heavily docked. If he dropped a heavy crate or complained about the freezing Midwestern wind whipping through the open warehouse bays, he was loudly berated in front of the entire crew. He was trapped in an exhausting, endless cycle of physical survival, entirely robbed of the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire existence. His sister Jasmine was faring no better in the unforgiving eyes of the federal government. Ethan had successfully finalized his immunity deal, completely selling her out to the Internal Revenue Service investigators just to save his own skin. He signed the divorce papers, packed his meager belongings, and fled the state, leaving Jasmine to face the full, unmitigated wrath of the federal prosecutors entirely alone. Because the stolen corporate funds were explicitly tied to her secure executive profile, and because she had absolutely zero financial resources left to fight a prolonged legal battle in federal court, she was forcefully pushed into a highly restrictive plea agreement. She narrowly avoided a federal prison sentence, but the alternative was a severe, suffocating, lifelong punishment. Jasmine was officially convicted of felony tax fraud and corporate embezzlement. She was placed on a grueling 5-year probationary period, requiring her to report weekly to a highly unsympathetic, stern federal parole officer who treated her like a common criminal. Her passport was permanently confiscated by the state. She was legally barred from ever holding a corporate management position or handling commercial finances again. She spent her long days working as a low-level customer service representative at a cheap retail call center. She was forced to wear a plastic headset and politely apologize to angry, screaming customers for 8 hours a day. Her wages were heavily garnished by the federal government to slowly repay the massive tax penalties she owed. She had to meticulously clip grocery coupons and budget her money down to the exact penny, a practice she had spent her entire adult life viciously mocking poor people for doing. The luxurious jet-setting lifestyle she had funded with my stolen money was completely replaced by a tiny gray cubicle and a crippling mountain of inescapable legal debt. The absolute worst fate of all, however, fell squarely upon Cynthia. She returned from Montana completely broken, having exhausted her absolute last sliver of delusional hope. She was forced to abandon her temporary motel room and move into a deeply depressing, cramped studio apartment located on the second floor of a decaying building near the industrial city limits. The neighborhood was loud, unsafe, and miles away from the exclusive, gated country clubs she used to fiercely dominate. The tiny apartment smelled permanently of stale cooking oil from the cheap, greasy diner operating on the ground floor. The heating system barely functioned during the brutal Chicago winters, and the thin, cracking walls offered absolutely no protection from the constant noise of the busy traffic below. She had completely alienated her children, who actively and aggressively blamed her for initiating the catastrophic chain of events that entirely ruined their lives. They refused to answer her phone calls and explicitly banned her from visiting their cheap rental units. Cynthia was utterly and profoundly alone. Her days were entirely devoid of purpose. She no longer had a massive staff of housekeepers to command, no lavish charity galas to plan, and no wealthy society friends to impress. She spent her waking hours sitting in a worn second-hand armchair she had found at a local thrift store, staring blankly out a small, dirty window that offered a magnificent view of a solid brick alleyway. Her only companions were the physical remnants of her shattered ego. Before Kendall's financial lean completely locked down the massive storage unit, Cynthia had managed to grab 2 large plastic bins containing a handful of her imported designer handbags and a few expensive dresses. Those luxury items were entirely useless to her now. She could not wear a highly expensive custom-tailored evening gown to the local discount grocery store. She could not carry a $5,000 leather purse on the crowded, dangerous public transit bus without making herself an immediate target for violent theft. The designer bags simply sat on a cheap plastic folding table in the corner of her cramped apartment, slowly gathering dust. They were pathetic, outdated monuments to a manufactured kingdom that no longer existed. She was trapped in a suffocating prison of her own immense pride, surrounded by the rotting ghosts of her former wealth, counting the meager pennies of her government assistance checks just to keep the cheap overhead lights turned on. The stark, grinding misery of their new reality stood in absolute contrast to the profound peace I had meticulously cultivated in Montana. I did not spend my days dwelling on their punishment or eagerly checking the internet for updates on their legal failures. I had entirely excised the toxic infection from my life, and the wound had beautifully permanently healed. I was not a lonely, bitter old man hiding away in the mountains. I had actively built a brand new, highly authentic community based entirely on mutual respect, hard work, and shared values. I regularly hosted large, lively dinners on my expansive wooden porch, filling the crisp mountain air with genuine laughter and the smell of smoked barbecue. My guests were not superficial socialites looking for a free meal or business contacts. They were honest, hard-working local ranchers, small business owners, and several former senior employees from my logistics company whom I had personally mentored and helped start their own successful commercial freight operations. These were people who deeply valued my wisdom, my corporate experience, and my friendship, not my credit limit. We talked about local politics, the changing seasons, and the simple, undeniable beauty of the surrounding wilderness. I sponsored a local youth baseball team, providing them with brand new uniforms and professional sporting equipment. I volunteered my decades of corporate management experience to help the town council optimize their municipal budget. I even adopted a large, incredibly loyal rescue dog from the local county shelter, a massive shepherd mix who followed me everywhere I went. I was deeply respected, highly valued, and completely surrounded by genuine warmth. My physical health, once failing rapidly under the immense toxic stress of my previous marriage, was completely restored. I slept deeply every single night, entirely unburdened by the constant paranoia of corporate betrayal or familial sabotage. I woke up every morning before the sun rose, breathing in the clean, freezing mountain air, feeling an immense, powerful gratitude for the second chance I had ruthlessly carved out for myself. The heart attack they had eagerly hoped would kill me had actually been the greatest gift I ever received. It violently shocked my physical system, permanently opening my eyes to the parasitic reality of my existence, and gave me the absolute unyielding strength to cut the dead weight loose forever. I often sit on my wide wooden porch as the sun dips below the jagged Montana peaks, watching the vast sky turn brilliant shades of bruised orange and deep purple. In these incredibly quiet, solitary moments, I think about the sheer volume of chaotic noise that used to define every single waking moment of my life. I think about the loud, aggressive charity galas Cynthia constantly insisted on hosting just to prove her social dominance. I think about the constant shrill complaints from Megan regarding her luxury vehicles and the frantic, arrogant phone calls from Kendall demanding immediate, unquestioned access to my corporate operational funds. My previous existence was a deafening, suffocating symphony of unearned entitlement. Now the absolute loudest sound I hear is the cold mountain wind rustling through the tall, ancient pine trees bordering my property. This profound transition did not happen by accident. It was the direct, highly calculated result of the silent adjustment. People completely misunderstand the true nature of retaliation and justice. When we are profoundly betrayed by the very people we love and provide for our fundamental biological instinct, demands immediate loud anger. We want to scream until our throats physically bleed. We want to hurl vicious insults, smash expensive things, and force our betrayers to acknowledge the immense crushing pain they have caused us. But anger is an incredibly loud, highly temporary emotion. It is a bright, chaotic flash that immediately warns your enemies of your exact position. It gives them ample time to raise their defensive shields, call their ruthless lawyers, and prepare their own counterattacks. Strategy, however, is entirely quiet. Strategy is cold, permanent, and absolutely devastating. When I lay paralyzed on that sterile hospital bed, listening to my wife of 35 years coldly complain about her Hawaiian vacation itinerary while my chest was ripped open with agony, my initial instinct was pure, blinding rage. I desperately wanted to grab the cellular phone from the emergency room doctor and scream at her until my failing heart gave out completely. But the core philosophy of the silent adjustment requires you to forcefully swallow that initial explosive urge. It demands that you quietly absorb the crushing blow, accurately calculate the exact weight of the betrayal, and systematically dismantle the financial and legal infrastructure that allows your abusers to thrive. You do not actively argue with a parasite. You simply quietly remove its primary food source and watch it wither away into nothing. Society places a massive, entirely unfair burden upon parents and devoted spouses. We are constantly conditioned to believe that biological blood and shared decades require unconditional, endless forgiveness. We are explicitly told by therapists, religious leaders, and cultural expectations that we must endure severe disrespect, emotional abuse, and blatant financial exploitation, simply because the abusers share our last name or sleep under our roof. I completely and utterly reject that toxic premise. Loyalty is a reciprocal currency. Respect is a mandatory baseline for any human relationship, regardless of genetics or marriage certificates. Kendall and Jasmine viewed my physical existence as nothing more than an automated biological bank account. Cynthia viewed our long marriage as a highly lucrative, binding corporate contract she could void the moment I showed physical weakness. Once I legally and financially removed myself from their parasitic equation, they simply ceased to exist in my conscious mind. I do not feel a single ounce of lingering guilt for the severe actions I took. I do not lie awake at night wondering if Kendall is shivering in his cheap warehouse uniform or if Cynthia is hungry in her cramped, noisy studio apartment. I do not wonder if Jasmine is struggling to pay her massive federal restitution fees. They are grown, fully capable adults who made highly calculated, profoundly malicious choices. They placed a massive, arrogant bet against my physical survival, eagerly anticipating my immediate death, so they could steal my empire without consequence. They played a ruthless game of corporate treason, and they lost absolutely everything. Their current misery is not a cruel punishment inflicted by me. It is the direct, unavoidable consequence of their own unadulterated greed. With the toxic element permanently eradicated from my daily life, I had to deliberately determine the ultimate destination of my remaining wealth. I had successfully liquidated the massive suburban estate, merged the logistics company for a premium corporate buyout, and secured my vast commercial assets. This left me with a staggering amount of liquid capital safely hidden inside my private accounts. I absolutely refused to let that money sit stagnant in a dark bank vault, and I certainly was not going to leave a single penny of it to any distant blood relatives who might suddenly decide to care about my well-being. I wanted my life's work to serve a genuine, powerful purpose. I picked up my secure phone and called Robert Klein one final time. I did not instruct my attorney to draft a traditional will or arrange a standard tax-deductible charitable donation to a faceless corporate organization. I ordered Robert to immediately establish a massive $5 million irrevocable trust. I directed him to utilize my vast private investigative resources to track down the exact medical personnel who were actively working at the downtown Chicago Medical Center on the specific Tuesday afternoon my heart completely failed. I found the two exhausted, overworked paramedics who sprinted into my glass-walled office, loaded my heavy body onto the stretcher, and drove the ambulance through heavy city traffic with absolute reckless precision. I found the young emergency room doctor who stood his ground, gripping the edge of my hospital bed in pure disgust when Cynthia told him she was flying to Maui. I found the quiet, dedicated, intensive care nurses who checked my vital signs in the middle of the dark night, holding my hand and offering genuine human comfort when my own family abandoned me to die entirely alone. The $5 million trust was structured as an absolute ironclad scholarship and financial grant foundation, specifically and exclusively dedicated to those exact individuals and their immediate families. I did not simply send them a polite thank you card or a hollow plaque of appreciation. I fundamentally altered the entire financial trajectory of their lives. The trust immediately paid off the massive, crippling medical school debts of the emergency room doctor in a single verified bank transfer. It fully funded the future university tuitions for the young children of the two paramedics. It provided massive unconditional cash down payments for the intensive care nurses to purchase their very first homes in safe neighborhoods. When Robert officially executed the financial transfers and personally notified the beneficiaries at the hospital, they were completely overwhelmed. They tried to politely decline the massive sums, claiming they were simply doing their assigned jobs that day. I instructed Robert to firmly refuse their rejections. I told him to explicitly explain to them that while the people who shared my last name were busy stealing my corporate funds and drinking expensive champagne on a tropical beach, they were the ones who actually fought aggressively to keep my heart beating. They demonstrated genuine human compassion and unwavering professional loyalty when I was at my absolute weakest. They did not just do their jobs. They gave me the profound gift of continued existence, allowing me the precise amount of time I needed to execute my ultimate justice. They earned every single dollar of my legacy. I take a deep breath of the freezing mountain air, feeling the familiar steady rhythm of my chest. The physical scars from the cardiac procedures are still highly visible across my skin, thick and raised, but they no longer bring me any pain or anxiety. They are simply permanent visual reminders of the exact moment I finally woke up from a 35-year illusion. I look around at my sturdy wooden house, my quiet land, and the rescue dog sleeping peacefully at my feet. I am completely surrounded by an impenetrable wall of absolute peace. My family genuinely believed that my physical collapse in that downtown office was their ultimate victory. They assumed my silence in the intensive care unit was a clear sign of mental defeat and total submission. They thought a heart attack made me weak. They forgot that surviving one just meant my heart was finally strong enough to cut them out. I also learned a profound lesson about the true nature of power. For decades, my family believed that power was loud. They thought it was found in screaming at waitstaff, flaunting designer labels, and holding executive titles they never actually earned. But true power is entirely silent. It is the absolute discipline to observe a betrayal without reacting emotionally. It is the quiet courage to dismantle your own life so you can rebuild it on a foundation of reality, rather than a comfortable lie. Real power is self-respect, and it is the ultimate weapon against those who try to exploit you. If you have ever had to silently cut toxic people out of your life to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more lessons on survival.